I think that's part of what I really love about what you're doing, because you're creating this little sacred space and corner in your own, because of who you are. This conversation is possible because of that. And why don't people take time, take a step back and think about these things that are so meaningful and that are soothing to our soul, and our spirit.
This is the Inner Landscape Travel Agency. Let's saunter across the psyche through creativity, self-discovery, and the sacred. If you're curious, playful, and seeking, welcome. Hi, Neseret. Thank you for joining for our conversational portrait. I first learned of your work through the metabolic psychiatry space, and in watching your YouTube channel, reading your posts on X, and listening to your interviews, I've admired your thoughtfulness, your dedication to living a life aligned with your values, of a holistic approach to health and of self-knowledge permeates your work. You present this gentle strength and confidence, an introvert who knows her gifts and who is attuned to herself, and someone who's found a life-affirming meaning in overcoming hardship, navigating chaos, and sacrificing certainty, all across decades and generations and continents. So thank you for telling your story and for teaching. Welcome, Neseret Bemient.
Thank you so much. Thank you for creating this beautiful space and for inviting me to share. I really appreciate what you do as well.
If we think about the inner landscape, going inward requires both literal and figurative silence. In your life, where's the silence?
Well, it's interesting when you talk about silence and solitude. I always kind of think about that is something that's needed for creative work and for creating meaning in times when you're not engaged in work or creativity, that there's has to be a balance between rest and silence and solitude and in creativity and being engaged in the world. And I think the more time that you have to be with yourself and observe silence and solitude, out of that is what comes in terms of creativity and the work that you're able to do. So I guess for me, I've always been an introvert, and I have felt alone many of the times because I felt I was a very different person since I was little. I was always curious about spirituality, esoteric, like symbolism, meaning, dreams. I think I was always drawn to what's kind of mysterious and what's the unknown, or something that's not really obvious. I always start my days with silence and solitude, observing silence and meditation and introspection. So there's kind of very different ways of looking at that. So that's a very interesting question, actually. Um, um, that's what I meant to say in the beginning too, that you create this space of being able to ask even questions as such, which is really beautiful. And to have that conversation about spirituality, or I appreciate that. So I would say that I spend a lot of time thinking about things very deeply. I think I've always been that way. I feel like I am in the phase of my life now where I feel like I'm speaking up more, putting myself out there in the public and discussing about things that are incredibly vulnerable and personal. And so, but I feel like it's time to speak up now. Maybe up until this point, they say life starts at 40. I think maybe that was a period of silence in my life where I was going through interesting experiences and learning and growing. And I have a level of being comfortable in my own skin now to be able to speak up and to share in the hopes that my experience and the things that I've learned in my life and my journey would be helpful to people.
During your stages of solitude and silence, mourning or otherwise, what thoughts like to visit?
I usually try to focus on gratitude. That's really important to me. The nature of our mind and brain is that it's a thought producing or fairy tale making machine. That's how I see it. And so I try not to be judgmental of what shows up. Whatever it is that's coming up, the thoughts that are interesting, or maybe I don't understand them, or they might seem strange. So whatever shows up is okay. But if I can, I like to start my day with thinking about the things I'm grateful for, even if it is as simple as that I have another day to learn and experience and to enjoy life. But I think the nature of our mind and our brain is meant to have all kinds of different thoughts come up, and that's okay. The most important thing would be just observance and awareness. And we have a choice whether to embrace or entertain a certain type of thought. But I think our brains are incredible in that. That's something more recent years I've realized. We have really very powerful minds and brains, and we don't totally understand how they work and how to sort of harness that power and energy for creativity and positivity and channeling our focus in a direction that we want to go. One of my spiritual teachers, Neville Goddard, says that the highest use of our consciousness is our ability to focus on what it is that we want, being drawn by a vision. So I always try even though I observe my mind closely and see what comes up, I try to channel or pick and choose the thoughts that I want to nurture and cultivate.
What about when you're not thinking about anything? What do you think when you're not thinking about anything?
I have to say that I am a person who loves thinking. And there are times when I am not thinking. I would say I am deeply engaged in something, such as like nature walks, for example, when I'm in the woods and going for a walk, and I like to go for a walk in the woods. And those times I'm okay with it. I don't have to focus on anything. Or when I'm with my partner and we can just be together and we don't have to say anything, and those silences are okay. I heard once that doing nothing mindfully is a milestone on the spiritual journey. So I think I am someone who probably has a little bit of a hard time with, because I have a pretty good analytical mind and I like thinking and I like the kind of exploration of different topics and things. I probably could use to be more comfortable with like nothing or silence in my mind.
For someone who enjoys thinking, what are your favorite thoughts to think?
I think about many different things. The mind, I think about sort of our brain and just the human existence. I'm fascinated by human psychology. I'm fascinated by kind of the mysteries and spirituality. I have studied, Christianity, Buddhism, Islam. Um, so those world religions and what they teach is fascinating to me. I love sort of dream interpretations and the subconscious mind, the power of the conscious and the subconscious mind. I think about visualization and manifestation, how the process of creation, that's really fascinating to me. How do we create things into being? I also think about mental health, obviously, and what helps people overcome challenges, resiliency, what helps people not just struggle and survive, but thrive. I'm fascinated about trauma and the impact of trauma on mental health. I'm fascinated by connection, relationships, what helps people establish trusting, safe, thriving relationships, and what helps them heal. I guess on a general sense, the main thing I really have been obsessed about and think about is change and transformation. Human beings, regardless of what they've been through, what has happened to them, what helps them thrive, what helps them move forward in their lives and become all that they can become and create like meaningful lives. When I was 16 years old, my English as a second language teacher gave me a book by Ogmandino called The Greatest Miracle in the World. And I was hooked. I started reading every self-help transformational book that I can get my hands on. And that's been, I would say, the main obsession for me. How do I overcome my own challenges and be the best version of myself? And then how do other people do the same thing?
Beyond thinking, what about your favorite sensory experiences?
So I'm very sensitive to smell. I love smelling my food before I eat. Um, I know it sounds so strange to some people, but I love the smell of, just different scents. I love walking. I could walk for miles and miles. Just the sensation of just walking. I love that. Sound is important to me. Like I probably get pretty overwhelmed with certain types of sounds. I like silence. I always complain and say like you can't go anywhere today, then like there's always, even at a restaurant, you're sitting down and there's always noise, but I do appreciate just silence. But I also love music and listening to lectures and just listening to sounds of birds in the morning. I used to love eating a variety of foods before ketogenic diet. Now it's before the meat diet mostly, but I used to just love variety and just texture and spice and all of that stuff. I had to give that up, but that was something important.
Can you share a story of someone of any species being curious about you?
Yeah, we had a little pug and he was just so adorable. And I found that when I wasn't having a great day, he would know. He would just come over and cuddle and just be there all the time. And I just felt like he had that sense of just, I think animals are so sensitive and beautiful and kind and non-judgmental. Yeah, that was an interesting experience because I didn't grow up with a lot of animals, and my partner loves pugs, and he and he grew up with animals, so it was kind of a different experience for me to have that because back in Ethiopia when I was growing up, they we didn't view animals like the way people view animals here in this culture. It was just a little bit different. Like dogs usually stayed outside and or cats, and So that was an interesting experience to connect with a little furry animal and really just have a connection. And they're very in tune, they're very sensitive to your energy. And I felt like curiosity is a good way to say it, but yeah, just a connection with the animal. That was interesting.
I imagine this is going to be a question that we're going to explore again and again. And we're going to keep revisiting it, even if only implicitly.
Mm-hmm.
I'm fascinated with the idea of sharing a space with someone, knowing that we might be looking at the same thing, we might be exploring the same thing, but we're experiencing it completely differently. I'll never know quite what it's like to be you, but I'm very curious to understand more of that. And what I'd like to understand is how, through your unique set of life experience, knowledge, cultural backgrounds, cultural lenses, and skills, what do you see today that few others can? Where do you see more depth and nuance and intricacy when you walk into a room, or you enter some space where, just through what you've prioritized and have inadvertently been exposed to, you know that you've been able to see a little bit more in those spaces?
I think my experience from childhood to now, living in a war-torn country and refugee camp, and then going through the mental health system as a clinician and as a patient myself, all of those experiences, one thing I would say if I had to sort of narrow it down is perspective. It has allowed me to have a very wide perspective on my understanding of the human journey, that suffering is inherent in life and there's degrees of suffering. Like I think we all suffer in some ways, but those early experiences that I've had help me appreciate what I have here in terms of the conveniences and technology and information, or the privileges that we have, living in Canada. But I also know that is not the reality for everyone. So I always have that perspective of where I came from and the challenges that were there, like, my grandmother not being able to read or write her entire life, and then the realities of war, a refugee camp, and then living in a developed country with all the conveniences and the privileges that I have. There's a certain level of equanimity that comes from having those experiences of acceptance of reality as it is, and that whatever I'm experiencing in this moment is just this experience, but there's like a range of possibilities of what human beings go through. I have a lot of compassion for people and their suffering because I have been through, I would say, a significant amount of trauma and suffering in my own life. So I try not to be judgmental because I have no idea, just like you're saying to me, like I don't know what it is like for you to experience life or to think about certain things or to be who you are. I don't know what I can say the same about you or every person that I meet, right? So I think there's a huge sort of level of non-judgment because I don't understand everything and I don't know everything, even though this is my experience. I think that's a big thing. There's a lot of compassion for people suffering and perspective of all the different realities that people experience in our world, and also a deep sense of gratitude for everything that I have experienced that allows me to have that perspective and to relate to people from that place.
Growing up, you experienced considerable periods of time and events where the sense of agency was missing substantially. Many of the decisions that your family had to make were based on necessary reactions to the environment around you that wasn't conducive to your safety, to even survival at times. And one of the things that I've wondered about is the idea of someone cultivating a sense of self, and to what extent that's possible when conditions are so tumultuous. I'm curious, when you first felt as if your sense of self was coalescing and that you could intuit the path that you were on.
That's an interesting question. I think I've always had a strong sense of self, but I haven't been clear about it or confidence in it until more recently, because my upbringing and my past has been so chaotic. So just to give you a background, when I was 4 years old, my dad died. And my mom describes my dad as the love of her life, and she was absolutely devastated. My younger brother was 20 days old when my dad died, and I really didn't have a very good memory of my dad. But my mom was my whole world at that age. And when he died, she was so grief-stricken and went into suicidal depression. So I felt like I lost her on the day that he died. And then from there, my mom remarried a couple of years later, and that relationship was extremely tumultuous. Um, he was physically abusive to her, and my mom also became just um, rageful, and she was angry at the world. She was angry at God. She was angry, period, that this man that she loved, which was my father, had been taken away from her. She was a young widow. She was in her late 20s. And I did not understand any of that dynamic then. And so as a child, I just thought my entire world was totaled. And then, of course, a few years later, when I was 9, there was a war that came to a head because the Eritreans wanted to separate from Ethiopia, and that was an ongoing civil war for over 20 years by that time, when it ended in 1991. And then refugee camps. So all those experiences, they were so chaotic. I felt alone most of the time and very fearful. And I didn't feel that I belonged within my family. In fact, I left home when I was 16 because there was still physical abuse happening. And I spent my high school years in a group home. So I would say by the time when I was in university, I felt completely lost. And that sense of self was the core of who I am, never changed. I think there is something within each human being, our true self, that never goes away, that always kind of, I feel like, guides us throughout our lives. And so I feel like I had that in my life. There was even the girl that left home at 16. We had just moved to Canada for 3 years. I didn't know anybody in Canada. I barely spoke English. I was just learning English. And I knew what was going on at home was not okay. So that 16-year-old was incredibly courageous to say, this is not okay, and leave what was familiar and familial without having any certainty of what was going to happen. And so I've always had that sense of like what was right or what I wanted from myself. But I would say I started to really have a better sense of myself through, for example, the person that took me in when I first left home was one of my English as a second language teachers. And she validated me and supported me. Then I ended up in a group home, and there were lots of people who were supportive and loving. And so what I learned over time was that I had people come into my life that I was able to have some safety and some trust. One of my teachers says that we are wounded in relationships and we heal in relationships. And so over the years, I found connections outside of my family of origin that acted like surrogate family for me, whether that was, friendships, teachers, therapists. I started to see myself in a little bit of a different light, but it's been a huge struggle in many ways. I had huge issues with trust and connections, which always brought up a huge amount of vulnerability, especially romantic relationships. And for me to heal from everything that has happened, I had a advanced mindfulness teacher, mentor, who was incredible mirror for me and made me realize that I was a strong person to have gone through everything that I have and still be who I am today. The same with my current partner, who's just incredible and very one of the kindest people that I know. And he's a really good mirror for me and probably sees me in ways that I didn't even see myself, and just incredibly patient and loving, and just allowed me to feel really safe and to step into my own power and to step into who I am in a new way. And so I think that process of being more of who we truly are is an ongoing process. I think all of us experience trauma in our childhood, in our journey, maybe in our journey in general. Some people come from, backgrounds where they feel their childhoods were perfect or whatnot, but you're still going to experience some things in life, whether that is loss or, through breakups or death, or there's all kinds of things that happen to people. And the challenge is always for us, how do we go through those experiences and retain who we are and retain our sense of self and not lose ourselves. And I think the more challenges you face in your life, that has the potential for an opportunity for huge growth, but there's also a potential to really lose yourself. And so I would say that I have always known who I am, but I haven't always been able to embody who I am in the way that I am doing today. And I'm sure 2 years down the road, or 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, it's going to be different. But I'm happy with where I am now, where I feel comfortable in my own skin. It's, going back to that first question that you have, I would say I've been silent for most of my life. And I'm now opening up and speaking up and being okay with being seen. And that's can be excruciating at times and painful, because there was a part of me that grew up thinking I was not okay, or lovable or worthy. So that's, and I know that a lot of people feel that way. Yeah, I think I really struggled with my self-worth. I think that's something that happens to people when they experience trauma and betrayal, especially at a very young age. And I've done a lot of studying around the impact of trauma and on mental health, and I've seen it in my work throughout, being a psychiatric RN. I would say most of the people that I've worked with had significant history of trauma. And it's not to say, to simplify anything, that trauma is there's multiple factors that influence a person's health and, physical health and mental health. But trauma is a huge one. It's an area that impacts so many people. And I would say over the years, that is one area that I'm also able to relate to people and to bring non-judgment and compassion around, because I have gone through a lot of my own suffering in that area. I would say this is something I have to work on every day, being healing the past and the challenges and traumas that I've gone through, but also being more of who I am. Oh, I didn't realize it was going to be this a little messy, but sorry.
It's what came up. There's nothing to apologize. There's nothing that can be apologized for.
Yeah. I think that is the journey in life and the challenge for all of us is to go through this life and everything that it entails, this journey of the human experience, and amazingly so, uniquely for each of us, and all that comes up in our path, and then to still remain open-hearted and having the willingness and the courage to be who we are, to think what we think, to feel what we feel, to be who we are, not like everybody else, but just uniquely who we are, and then to thrive in that place. And I think that's an ongoing journey.
You mentioned feeling lost, and through different stages of feeling lost, and that only somewhat more recently have you felt everything within you coalescing to be expressed. Prior to this more recent chapter, where have you been able to restore yourself when you were lost?
I think this was an incremental shift over time. I would say the first time that I felt completely lost was when my dad died and my mom lost her mind. And then from there on, I felt like I was alone in many ways. But incrementally, I try to find a way for me to feel better and to move forward. And I think it's hard to pinpoint a specific time or person or space, but I feel like somehow I followed what felt more authentic to me, or what I felt was right. And different people showed up at different times that reflected a little bit of who I was for me. And even today, there are times when I think part of that life journey and experience for all of us is there's going to be times when we feel lost, or when we're afraid, or when we're uncertain. I don't know that will ever go away, but because that's the range of the human experience and what it means to not know. It's part of it is a mystery. One huge moment for me was when my daughter was born. I was 22 years old, and I remember thinking, as soon as I knew I was pregnant, which was pretty early on, I just had this instinct to want to protect her and to want to be everything that I could for her, not just for me. That was sort of a dividing line, because I think when she came along, I felt like I had a renewed sense of hope. Even though I would say that I wasn't ready to be a mother. I really didn't know anything much about what it means to be a mother. I had this instinct. Oh my gosh. Talk about like a spiritual journey. I would say parenting is one of those that a lot of people go through and that you're never prepared for. And but my daughter was a huge turning point for me. I don't know if I would actually sometimes think that if she didn't come along, I don't know if I would still be around. That was a huge sort of turning point in my life. And as soon as I did everything when I was pregnant to just make sure she was healthy and, ate right and read the books and just did everything I could. And I just had that instinct to want to protect her and be the best I can for her as well. And so I kind of had a reason to keep going. But at the same time, you talk about feeling lost. I I felt lost, and I wanted to do a good job, but I didn't know what that meant. Like I didn't know what I didn't know, and I didn't realize how hard it was going to be. So I've had different motherhood being a huge one, and then of course I knew about shortly after she was born, I went back to school, finished, and became a nurse. And then while I was learning about mental health, I learned about intergenerational trauma, and I realized I had huge intergenerational trauma in my family. My grandmother was married in an arranged marriage by the time she was 9. She had her first child when she was 14. Then my mom, and what we went through with my mom, and so I realized I had this urgency of I need to figure things out and heal myself so that I don't pass this to my daughter. And it felt like it was this race against time, not only to raise her, but to raise my own like wounded inner child. Because I knew that if I didn't do that, then I can't be there for her. And so, and then going through being a mental health nurse it brought up a lot of things that I needed to look at and work through, because many of the people that I worked with had similar issues or they've had challenging backgrounds. And so I was faced continually to look at myself and to heal those parts of me. Another area that I feel like I had a huge growth area was romantic relationships, which I had challenges with because they just naturally bring up everything that any of your issues around trust or vulnerability or communication and being able to be authentic and yourself in that connection. And so yeah, I was married to my daughter's father for a short time, and that didn't work out, and that was incredibly devastating for me. I think when you come from sort of losing your family of origin, I think there's a part of you that longs to be in connection and to have your own family. And so when that doesn't work out, it always triggers the loss and abandonment that you feel in those previous connections that you've had. And so that was really tough. And I think over the years, I went through periods where I felt any time that those relationships didn't work out, that it was so devastating and triggered everything from the past. But I've been with my current partner for a while now, and it's incredibly stable and has been um, a huge part of my healing. But yeah, it's pretty messy, this journey that we call life. And I think there's different points where we feel lost along the way. I I always think it's not for the faint of heart, like just the spiritual journey or like the journey of being a human being.
You mentioned how after your daughter was born, shortly afterwards, you went to school. You finished, became a nurse, and also that it was in nursing school that you felt quite lost.
Yeah.
In another interview, you mentioned how you weren't quite sure about the path you wanted to take within nursing until you came across mental health.
Yeah.
Can you share a bit about what was it symbolically, abstractly that resonated with you about mental health that you decided to pursue that?
Yeah. The reason was I wanted to understand myself first. I wasn't sure what was going on, why I felt the way I did. And I was into self-help and personal development, but that can only take you so far in understanding yourself. And so when I first started to learn about mental health, it just deeply resonated because I needed to understand how the events and things that I went through and experienced impacted me, but also learning about trauma, the effects of going through, you know, different types of challenges and stress, like living in a refugee camp. What did that have? Or even just in general, what people experience. How does that impact them? Family dynamics, that's another area that I feel I was really interested in terms of intergenerational trauma. And, you know, they say that the number one source of violence in the world is not war, is not people living in a refugee camp, it's domestic violence. So especially the things that happen between, you know, when you're in utero and 7 or 8 years old, they have huge implications for in every aspect of your life, physically, mentally, how you show up in relationships, how you relate to people, how you view the world. And to me, it was this space where I realized I want to learn and understand what happens to people and their experiences, especially their elderly experiences. How does that set them up to thrive and to grow, or also when they really go through a lifetime of a challenge? And I think, it may seem like a selfish reason, but for me, it was my curiosity to try to understand myself, my family, and other people that kind of resonated on such a deep level. And there's nothing wrong with that in a way. Actually, they say, the first patient on the operating table is yourself. And if you can't understand yourself, and if you can't heal yourself, then you don't have much to offer to other people. So initially, I would say I I wasn't feeling that great. I wasn't happy. I wasn't thriving. I was struggling. And so I was like, well, self-development had like that one piece, or spirituality, but like, what does human psychology say? Like, how do I understand myself in that context? And so that was part of the reason it was attractive to me.
Back then, you also saw, but it took you several years before you could identify what what the challenges were. You saw something there that was misaligned with what you knew growing up, because you grew up with herbalists and those who are focused on connection and spirituality and community as part of the healing process. I want to know more about that, and I want to know more about what you felt was missing and how things clicked for you once you're able to define what that was.
For one thing, for example, when I was growing up, our grandparents lived with us. So there wasn't like nursing homes that they can go to. So, and they were different people when they were older. So they were very loving and compassionate towards us. There was always extended family around. My grandfather was very religious. He used to like walk to church every Sunday. My grandmother lived in a monastery for like the last 20 years of her life. There was some positive experiences I had as a child. It wasn't all, you know, traumatic. A lot of it was, but I wasn't aware of a mental health system when we were in Ethiopia. So that was an interesting sort of experience. And the culture itself, people were closer knit, and families would, for example, just show up at your door to visit, like they don't call ahead or anything like that. So I grew up with like watching those things. And I don't remember when I was a kid of like taking any types of medications for most things. It was either through your diet, or um, some people believed in prayer, or just having connections and close connections and people around you. But it wasn't sort of like a very medicalized system. But when I came here, I felt like, oh, we're in Canada now, and this is a civilized, developed country, and this is what people do. They go to a doctor or the hospital because that's kind of, the state of the art um, treatment. And so there was a little bit of sort of fascination, but also thinking this is the better way, because you don't, coming from where we came from, at that age, at least, I didn't know kind of the values of, there's a value in both ways, or both systems in a way. Western medicine has advanced a lot of things for people, where we've been able to eradicate certain illnesses through vaccine or whatnot. So there's like a value in that. And then there's value in exploring spirituality or nutrition or connections and all those things as well. I didn't always appreciate or have that perspective. Now that I'm older, I can look back and say, okay, yeah, this is helpful and this is helpful. There's the best of both worlds. But I would say at the time after we moved here, and as I was going through my schooling, and then I started working in the system, I thought this is the way. or maybe this is superior, you know?
And for a while, you understandably followed that, a system that you perceived as superior. And you noticed when it wasn't meeting the needs of patients. And there came a point where you struggled to reconcile what you knew and what you saw with what you were expected to do at work.
I knew right away when I started seeing people who weren't getting better. I started seeing people who were being put on medications and they were experiencing really serious side effects. And over time, I realized actually there's some issues in this system. It's not a perfect system, as I thought, that there is challenges within it, especially for, you know, due to more recently shortage of doctors and shortage of workers, that the medications can be a good temporary measure, but they're not always the solution long term, especially when it comes to psychiatry. And so I started to observe things and patterns that I knew weren't helpful in the long run for people. And also that some of the other areas that could be explored, whether that is spirituality or connections or work, meaningful work or creativity or diet, weren't given adequate time or exploration or addressing trauma and all of those things. And so I realized it's heavily sort of leaned towards a biomedical model, which means medication and illness being defined as originating in the person only and treating that person. And I also realized that illness and dysfunction doesn't just originate in an individual. The person comes out of a family. They come out of a community or a country or a greater world. And there is many different forces acting on them. And so in order to actually truly address an issue, it needs to be approached from multiple sides. And if you're going to treat the individual, then you need to treat the family. If you're going to treat the family, then you need to treat the community. And so I realized with Western medicine, it's very much honed, and psychiatry, it's very much honed in the individual and usually thinking there is a virus or a disease, or even if it is a mental illness now, they, quote unquote, chemical imbalance, which is a theory. That's all it is. It's not even founded on anything, any evidence per se. So I realized, okay, well, this is not a perfect system and it doesn't really serve everyone and it doesn't work for everyone. And then just kind of looking back and thinking, okay, well, there are some things that indigenous cultures or even the culture that I came out of, people explore. And is there value in those things? And what's the value? How do you find the middle ground of getting the best of both worlds?
What were you hoping to offer patients in addition to the services that you were expected to provide?
The biggest thing for me is to help people realize that the thing, at least from my own experience, that has helped me heal wasn't just a single thing. It was multiple things that helped me. I could list like 13 different things that has helped me heal just from me. And I'm sure like for each person, there's a combination of things, whatever they may be. There's some fundamentals like diet and movement, addressing trauma, proper sleep, healthy connections. But then there's like a plethora of other things that could work for a person. It doesn't have to be a one size fit all approach. And also the other piece, so there's that of comprehensive, holistic approach. But the other piece is that no matter who you are and what you've experienced and what you've gone through, if you're determined that you want to find healing and wholeness, there is a path. It's not an easy path. And most of it is an inner journey. It's not an outer journey. It's not the next pill journey. It's not a Prozac journey. It's not, let me go get a 6-figure job journey. And that's, or go get my partner who's going to complete me. No, that's not what it is. There's an inner journey that you have to go through. You must go through. And that involves looking at yourself in the mirror. That involves facing your fears and demons and wounds. That involves in your willingness to be who you are and to meet those wounded aspects of yourself and love them and accept them. That is really the ultimate journey and healing. Everything else is sort of a little bit of a distraction in a way. And earlier we talked about the mind and the brain. I really believe that if you can go on that inward journey, then you have everything that you need within you to heal your body, to heal your brain, to heal whatever is going on. Like you hear some people who come back from cancer, some people who were pronounced dead and they come back. So I don't think we realize how powerful we are and how sophisticated our body and our brains are and their capabilities. We've only scratched the surface in that area. And so for a lot of people in the psychiatric system, they're told you have this illness, they're given a diagnosis, and then they are told you have this for life and you're going to take these medications for life, whether they give you horrible side effects or not. And this is your path. And that's what I was told as well with antidepressant-induced bipolar disorder. I didn't want to believe that for myself, and I don't think mental illness or any type of illness is hopeless or incurable. That you could, if you take the time and if you're willing to explore different aspects of yourself, there's ways of healing. But even if there was a condition that could not be healed, then you could live that life and that experience in a way that's meaningful and in a way that is going to allow you to live a certain quality of life or have peace of mind. So you don't make living or dying into some problem. You could just, if you do suffer and if you die, you suffer and die in dignity. But the other piece is there's many, many possibilities, which means you could find healing and you could move forward. Even if somebody pronounced it that this is not curable. There's been many things that have been dubbed incurable, and now we have solutions for them. So I think part of that being a spiritual person is recognizing that there are many options and possibilities and not giving up.
With patients, how did you try to focus on their needs beyond not just their needs? How did you try to focus on them beyond their chemicals and hormones, but on their psyche? And what did it mean for a patient for you to focus on what happened to them as a person and what led them to this place of anguish?
I would say the biggest gift that we can give someone is to listen to them, to give them space to share their innermost thoughts and feelings. You know, I think, that's what you're doing, at least for me in this moment. And that is the greatest gift that you can give to someone, to listen to them without judgment and to be curious about their experience of life. I would say that was something I was good at from the beginning. I was curious. I wanted to know what people were experiencing, what they were going through. And I wanted them to know that I could listen to them and really hear them without judgment and with a lot of compassion. And there is a book by Louis L. Madrona called Narrative Medicine. It's a It's a beautiful book. And he's a physician and a psychiatrist, and he's written many books. He's of an indigenous background and just a beautiful writer. And he talks about how there is healing in people being able to share their story, just to have the space to you create a sacred space for them to share their story. I've always believed that my clients have been one of my greatest teachers, and I would say even helped me heal. And I've learned a lot from them and their courage and their strengths and their resiliency. And I always had that sense that this person sitting in front of me is capable and strong and is resourceful and has their own path to healing, and that they have that within them. I am not there to fix them. I can share my journey with them and I can share what has helped me. But they also have so much to give and so much resources that they bring with them, and their experience and their wisdom and their understanding. And so most people just need a space. They don't need you to fix them. They want you to sit in their darkness. They want to find somebody who has sat with their own darkness, with their own fear and terror, that can sit with them as they explore their own path and find their own way. So how you view the person that you're interacting with is huge. And people can sense that. People can sense when you approach them with respect, when you approach them with compassion, and when you approach them with um, that unconditional positive regard. And so I would say that is what I had to offer to my clients. Now I have more tools in terms of the ketogenic diet, in terms of deprescribing and safe tapering, providing support in that process to people. But ultimately, everybody has their own healing journey and healing path, and they have everything that they need within them to go in that journey. I think as human beings, we thrive with encouragement and support. And that is the biggest thing that's lacking in the system for some people, is that there's no belief in their ability to return to their wholeness and to heal and to move forward in their lives. It's a conversation around illness and diagnoses and medication, and no, this is a lifelong thing. And people feel really hopeless in those conversations, in that language.
You mentioned that you were able to show up with this genuine compassion and curiosity, and to make space for your patients and for your clients. What do you think allowed you to be able to do that you had that within you?
I would say I actually, when I was 30 years old, I was diagnosed with depression. At the time, I would say it was actually a misdiagnosis, because I had untreated, undiagnosed hypothyroid disorder, which mimics psychiatric symptoms. I had significant unresolved trauma from my childhood and as I was coming up. And I was also, after having worked in acute care for 4 years, I was in burnout. So as soon as I was tried on the antidepressant, it triggered a hypomanic episode. And then I was offered more medications. And I was, along with my patients, struggling to find answers and struggling with psychiatric medications. I was trialed on 10 different medications over a 13-year period at different lengths. I would say about 8 of them I had to immediately get off of them because I had an adverse reaction. And so going through that experience, not just as a clinician, but as a service user, I realized, oh, this is what my patients, I've observed this along the way. And so I had that experience of thinking, oh, Western medicine, I got on birth control pills, which was, I think, one of the biggest mistakes that I made, because birth control pills actually make women at high risk for anxiety, depression, and suicide. Psychiatric medications, I thought, well, maybe after everything that I've been through, I must have some sort of disorder, maybe anxiety, depression, PTSD, who knows? And so I thought, oh, medication might help, perhaps. And so I went on that journey. And when I look back, I'm just like, for 20 years, I was on different medications, and I realized my mental health or even physical health didn't get better. In fact, I think I experienced worse, sort of worsening symptoms over time. And I consider myself a very resilient and strong person and healthy person for the most part, especially having gone through everything that I went through. So for me, for example, one of the most disturbing things that happened while I was on psychiatric medication for those 13 years is I had a worsening suicidal ideation. I never, before I was 30 years old, having gone through everything I went through, I never considered suicide. It was not on my radar. I like living. I like my experiences. I like learning, growing. I like being, I, I, I don't want to die. And so that was incredibly disturbing. Um, I had my daughter at the time, but there was also incredible amount of shame and feeling of worthlessness. Um, and also even as a nurse thinking, I should know better. I should be feeling better because here I am, I'm a psych nurse. This is supposed to be my expertise, and I'm still in the same boat as my clients because I am struggling. And so um, it was an interesting experience to go through. And it showed me sort of the path that people walk through when it comes to stigma, when it comes to side effects of medications, when it comes to um, just feeling hopeless. At some points, I thought, is this my life? Like, is this the rest of my life? Like, what? And in terms of creativity, I remember starting my YouTube channel in 2011 thinking I want to raise awareness about mental health, and I barely had any energy to just keep doing the basic things in life. So I didn't have that. And many people that experience mental illness have such a harrowing journey, an incredible amount of loss that comes with that. That's, kids dropping out of school, not finishing school, losing jobs, losing connections, breaking off an engagement, the hit to their self-esteem. And then I've seen people balloon to like 100 pounds in 6 months on certain medications. And so certain people have sexual side effects that are permanent, even after one or two doses of medication or a short treatment. It's a complete disaster. And I realized this is not helpful. And I could relate to my clients, of course, on that, on the basis of working with them and also on the basis of me going through that similar experience.
And especially as you were in the place where you could empathize even more than before, where you saw something wasn't working and you saw the side effects. Now you were living those side effects.
Yeah. Yeah. Not to say that, people can't relate or understand unless they go through their own experience, but it definitely gives you, that's walking a mile in a person's shoes. You realize, okay, I know these people and what they're going through because I understand. I've gone through it myself.
One of the quotes I've heard you share is, a person who is healthy has 1,000 dreams. A person who is sick has just one: to feel better. Can you share more about when you only had the one dream of your journey through malady and then back to wholeness?
Yeah, and I don't know where I heard that saying, but I remember reading it and thinking, oh my goodness, that is so true. During those 13 years when I was on medications and going through the mental health system as a patient, I had the side effects from medications were like I gained 20 pounds, I had brain fog, I could sleep 13, 14 hours a day. I had in the background always some suicidal ideation. I say that I kind of sleepwalk through um, 2/3 of my daughter's life, and that had tremendous impact on her mental health. And being a good mother was so important to me. And I would say I had tremendous guilt and shame around not being the kind of mother that I wanted to be because I was just barely surviving. At some points along the way, I felt like I don't think I am any good to anyone. I am just barely surviving and struggling. I don't have much to offer to my clients. I felt at that point because I am suffering and they're suffering and there's no real solution. So it was just a desperate place, and I wasn't sure if things were going to get better. And I know a lot of people don't understand why somebody would consider suicide, but they're a person who is living with unrelenting pain and suffering. It feels like a logical step. It's not that people want to die deep down, and I've worked with hundreds of people, thousands of people who struggle with suicidal ideation. But my understanding over time, having done so many suicide risk assessments and talking to people, they want the pain to stop, and they feel like they don't have hope. And so a human being can live with that for so long before logically their mind realizes, what is the point of suffering? What's the point of continuing to suffer? Especially if there is no light at the end of this tunnel. I always tell people there's always hope, and I try to figure that out. For me, it was a 7-year journey where I implemented certain things along the way, including the ketogenic diet, but it was a 7-year process. It was not overnight. And it was multiple things that I did that all compounded and came together to a place where I felt better. And I was able to taper off of all the medications. But that period, I describe it as a 13-year nightmare. That's what it was. It was an absolute nightmare. And there was a lot of losses that occurred. And I still grieve some of those things. And there are things that I'm going to grieve for the rest of my life. And I think that is something that people don't realize for others as well when they're going through their mental health journey and they're diagnosed and then they go in through the system. The losses mount, and there's so much loss, not to mention, your self-esteem, your self-confidence, your dignity, your humanity. But there is financial loss, relationship loss, all kinds of losses. You're putting a person on the wrong medication and wrong diagnosis. It can cost them their life. And that is something that really like boils my blood, is how fast people are handed diagnoses that'll follow them for life, and how fast they're put on medications that have life-altering consequences. Whether that is becoming dependent, like in the case of benzodiazepines, even antidepressant, all psychiatric medications have the potential for you to develop dependency. And people are not fully informed of all the possible consequences of their choices. And this is including children. So to me, that's terrifying. It's very sad, and it's scary for people what they face when they're just placed on medications and um, go through that journey. It's very hard. It can be devastating.
How have you been able to make meaning or find meaning through the suffering you've had to navigate and overcome?
I look at it from a bigger perspective. I always try to look at my life and my experiences from a higher perspective. One of the core themes that runs through at least my life, and maybe for many people's life, like I said, is suffering being inherent. Sure, Viktor Frankl, he wrote Man's Search for Meaning. He lived in Auschwitz for a few years and wrote this book about finding meaning in suffering. He said there's three ways that we find meaning. One is through love, and the other one is through work, like service. And then the third one, he said, was in suffering. So he said, if suffering can be helped, that is the right thing to do. But if suffering cannot be helped, then it is to suffer indignity. There's meaning in it. And he developed a type of therapy called logotherapy, which is finding meaning in suffering. And so that is one area that we all have to work with as human beings, is just the reality of suffering. But the other theme is this journey, the hero's journey of becoming more of who we truly are despite suffering. And for me, when I look back, I realize that the work that I am able to do today in providing hope for people, and that's one of the things that clients always tell me. One, they say that they can relate to my story and what I've gone through. And then second, they feel like there's hope for them, because if I can heal and find meaning coming through everything that I went through, and there's many people who will go through worse things than I do. So you can never fairly compare people's suffering. It just doesn't work that way. So I feel like going through that experience as a psych nurse and as a person who was a service user helps me understand the group of people that I deeply care about and want to serve. I know their pain points. I know their challenges. I know their struggles. I know what they go through with medications, with the diagnosis, with everything. So to me, I look back and I say I can bring a broader perspective on mental health based on everything that I went through, that it doesn't have to be this narrow definition of what a mental health is and how it is dealt with in the system. I don't care if it is in the Western society. I don't care if it's in Africa. I don't care if it is wherever. I have people contacting me pretty much from all over the world, all over the place. And they are able to look at my perspective and that it resonates with them and it gives them hope that there's ways to obtain peace of mind. There's ways to go back to your wholeness, to experience life and to learn to thrive despite challenges that you may have. And so I feel like I sometimes believe that we are in ways prepared to do the work that we're meant to do, and in the way that we come up, in the way where we find ourselves. Like, I didn't choose to be born in Ethiopia. I didn't choose to be born to the family that I was born into, to grow up in the country that I did, to live in a refugee camp, or even to come to Canada. I found myself in those circumstances and situations. And some people say, why did you go to, become a psych nurse? Like, what made you decide that? And I'm like, I think psych nurse picked me. It's not that I actually picked psych nursing. Like I said, I was the student who's terrified going through nursing school thinking, I think I've made a grave mistake. And so I kind of feel like life has a way of taking us through experiences and places and people and the families we're born into and what country we're like. I know it seems, when I look back now, it makes sense, that path that was kind of late in a way laid out. And I'm not a deterministic person, as in like, this was predetermined. But when I look back now and I can connect the dots, I think Steve Jobs was who said that when you can look back, you can connect the dots. And I can clearly see a path that I was going through. And it was a really tough one. It's a really tough path. And I think everybody gets the challenges that they're capable of enduring and going through to go through that experience. But if you look in your life, there's a theme and a pattern. The things that you're interested in, your deepest heart's desires, your sort of way of being and thinking and who you are at your core. There's nobody that has that. That's uniquely yours. And I don't think it's an accident. I really don't. The longer I live, the more I realize I don't think any of it was an accident. And there's along the way, you're going to feel completely lost. You're going to feel scared, alone, but you're still on your path. Life has sort of that plan for you to go in a certain direction. And if you're willing to follow it, if you're willing to be courageous and be yourself and appreciate that path and have gratitude for it, then it's going to make sense. Because the truth of it is, I feel like we're all on the same journey. It may be looking differently, but the ultimate journey is that journey from suffering to finding peace of mind, journey from not being who you are and struggling and not feeling safe to finding comfort and peace and solace, from feeling like you're not whole or you're not worthy or you're not good enough, to coming to a place of being okay to be yourself and be comfortable in your own skin. So those, and also going from fear and maybe paranoia or aloneness to a sense of connection with yourself or a sense of connection with another, and or a purpose greater than yourself, and being able to find meaning in the work that you do or your creativity or your passion. And so that journey, like there's themes that all of us kind of go through or like are on the journey of experiencing. It may look differently for everyone, but ultimately that is sort of the, we talk about spirituality. That is the core of who we are as powerful, limitless, creative, wise, loving, compassionate people.
You mentioned that you were willing to try anything, in part on behalf of your daughter. And you also lamented that in doing so, without realizing what some of the side effects were, you felt as if you were not quite there for her for a good chunk of her life. I'm curious about how you've since been able to nurture and repair your relationship with her, and what it means to you to continue to become the mother that you wanted to be.
Being the mother that I want to be means everything to me. Just like being the best version of myself as a human being. That's really, I don't think kids follow what you say. Kids follow who you are as a person and who you become, that example that you set for them. And I wanted my daughter to know who I was and what happened and how it impacted me and where she came from. I actually kept a journal recently for about a year, and I wrote everything down. I wrote letters to her, and I went back into my childhood. I went back about her grandmother, her great grandmother, our history, and then also my journey through the mental health system, what I went through, everything. And I gave it to her as a birthday gift when she turned uh, 21. And I think she really loved that. And she's a very strong person. My daughter is beautiful and she's smart and incredibly strong. She's seen me through, my worst challenges, and she's seen me also figuring out a way for me to find health and healing. And she knows how hard I've worked on it. During those years when she was younger, I think it was confusing and hard for her because she knew that I was struggling. She knew that I was not well. And I don't want to go into too much detail about her because that's her story. But for me, I knew that it was impacting her, and that guilt and that shame, that was, I think, what actually led me at one point when she was 14 years old. I considered suicide seriously. I never have attempted suicide, but I've gotten to a point where I thought I'm not even a good mother. I think that's the worst shame and deep fear. I think I was able to withstand so many things, but that just broke my heart. And I'm glad that I realize even now when she's 21 years old, she needs me just as much as she needed me when she was little. You know, I think those years were so easy when she was little. I used to have a little sling, and I used to just carry her, and we would go everywhere, you know, to the mall, to like visiting friends, to a movie, whatever it was. And when they're little, it feels like it was easy. But I remember dropping her off the first day of school when she was 5, and she was so tiny, and it was an elementary school where there was the grade 6 students who were like really tall, and I was just thought, I remember just leaving her there and just bawling, going back to my car and just absolutely bawling. And now, the past 6, 7 years, as I slowly came out of, you know, the stupor, I was able to reconnect with her and share with her things as she got older that she could understand, of those times that I went through where I wasn't, you know, one time she said to me, just reflecting back on her childhood and how things were, she said, "Mom, you were always there, but sometimes you weren't all there." And that was one of the saddest things to hear from, you know, for a mother. At the same time, I knew what she meant, and it was true. Um, because, you know, I was always working, able to provide for her. I was always there. But there were times where I was emotionally checked out or really cut off. Actually, one of the things that people experience on antidepressants or psychiatric medications in general is that, you know, it does take the edge off of the negative emotions, but you're also cut off from your creativity. You're also cut off from your positive emotions that you feel. And so that was a sad thing to hear from my daughter, to say, yeah, you were there, but you weren't all there. But it was accurate. It was distinct. I was just like, I don't disagree with you. And so I was able to have those conversations with her, not only just on a general sense of like mental health, but also to say, hey, it's nothing to do with you. You know, like, I love you and I want to be there for you. And I really was impacted by this experience. So I wasn't able to be the mother that I really wanted to be for you. But that didn't mean that I don't love you. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. That doesn't mean that you're not worthy of my love or my attention. And so to have that repair and healing with her, and that was something that I really didn't have with my mother necessarily, just based on where she was and what has happened in her own life, and having had maybe not processed her own traumas. So that's something that I feel I am proud of that I have with my daughter, is that our relationship, you know, had challenges because of what I was going through and where I came from, but we were able to work through it. And it's not perfect, but it is so much better than it's ever been. I feel that, you know, our relationship is going to continue to grow. And as she starts to become more of who she is, and I am able to be more of who I am, then it will continue to grow and repair. Yeah, I'm grateful. I would say my daughter is one of my greatest teachers, but she's also a motivating factor for me to work through my own issues and to be a better person as a human being. And through that example, and I hope that she also has um, her own journey and her own path. That's another thing I realized. My daughter, I always thought, she was her own person since she was little. She just had her own ways. She was very particular about the kinds of things that she wanted to do and who she was and how she shows up. And I thought, she's not my anything. Like, she's her own individual person. And I've had, I worked in children's emergency for 5 years, and I worked with parents and kids, so I can relate to people on that level, being, a mother. And so many parents have a lot of guilt and a lot of worry about their kids. And I'm just like, our kids are incredibly resilient. They're not porcelain dolls. They are wired for struggles and they have their own path. A parent is a guardrail. You're not the path, you're the guardrail. And so part of the challenge as a parent is to let them be who they are and have trust that they have their own path. Their steps are ordered just the same as everyone else's, all of us, and that they're going to find their way. And the hardest thing, I think, for parents is to watch their kids suffer or struggle. But at the same time, those things that kids go through, the challenges they experience, is going to be part of their journey of growth and development. And I would say that is one of the hardest things for parents when they're experiencing their own mental health issues and knowing how that impacts their kids to recognize. But the work is still the same. You still have to look inward and sort yourself out. And that is the best gift you can give your child. It doesn't mean no parent is perfect. And there are things that are going to happen to you as a parent, whether that's a physical illness or a divorce or somebody dying or whatever it is. Like, you're not a perfect person, but at the end of the day, if you can acknowledge that, and I'm okay with my daughter to say, hey, I was checked out for some time and I'm sorry, like, I wasn't there for you emotionally. I provided for you financially and physically, I was there, but there were things that I wasn't able to give you that were a requirement for you to thrive. But that doesn't mean I didn't love you. That doesn't mean I still had to sort through my own. I always tease her and say we grew up together. Had to grow up together. I said I was having to raise my own little girl and then raising you. And then I got on a psychiatric cocktail and went to shits, the whole thing. But we both survived. Oh my gosh. Yeah. So, yeah. I mean, I could have those conversations with her and we're okay. We're both, learning and growing still.
I'm curious about how your worldview has shifted now that you know so much more about yourself and that you can trust your body and your perception of reality, and you are able to fundamentally help others.
I feel like I am one of the luckiest people in the world. I feel so blessed to be where I am right now. And I never really thought of myself as a victim. I don't think of myself as that. Even when I look back and I see what has happened um, in my life, I feel like all of it was part of, for all of us, it's part of that masterpiece. It's like that tapestry. I mean, you look at the picture that's behind me. It's a beautiful tapestry cloth that has every little line and every little thread that brings up this picture, a beautiful picture at the end. And I think that's our lives, all of our lives. And none of it is a mistake. And even when I look back at the most painful things, like, I would say my relationship with my family, with my mom specifically, was one of the most painful things in my life because I never felt connected and belonged in that family because of the things that happened. But I can also look at my family and the resilience that they've had and the lessons that were learned in that process. So when I look back, I can't pick and choose to say, well, this was good, this was bad, this was good, this was bad. No, actually, all of it has brought me to where I am today. And so I'm grateful for everything. And I think that is one of the areas where I feel when you come to a place where you're grateful for everything that has happened in your life, doesn't matter what it is, and you take 100% responsibility for it, then you are in a healthy and good place. It doesn't matter what it is. And then the other piece is I realize I'm a very privileged person living in a free country where my grandmother didn't even know how to read or write. And my mother had a very challenging life, and she was a very strong woman as well. She had her own demons that she had to deal with, but she raised 6 children. She brought us into a new country. She had education. She wanted a different life from her mom. My mom is still a beautiful person. I look at her, I've forgiven her for what happened because I understand where she was in this desperate place of losing the love of her life and then having to raise 6 children on her own and living in that country that she did, all of it. So I look back now and I look at everything and I say, well, I get to do something that is so meaningful in my life, which is connecting with people and sharing my experiences and providing hope for them and trying to point out their own inner resources, their own golden nuggets from their lives and um, encouraging them. And so to me, it's just like, it's the ultimate blessing and gift. So I wake up every day thinking, I'm thankful for everything. And some of it has been harrowing and hard and scary and terrifying. And I still have to work every single day to be the best version that I can be. But it's a labor of love and it's a joyful experience. Doesn't mean I don't have challenges. It doesn't mean that I still have so many things to learn and grow. But I wouldn't trade who I am and where I am for anything right now.
Can you introduce me to the 1,000 dreams you've dreamt since recovery?
You know, I've always had so many dreams. And I think the biggest one was always to know who I am and be comfortable in who I am. But I have dreams about writing books. I have dreams about traveling. I my dream is to live in Barbados. That is a place that that's connected to one of my teachers, Neville Goddard. He's from Barbados, and I want to spend more time with my daughter as she gets older and just more time it's not to make up for lost times, but that's always a precious time for me to be able to be with her. My partner and our relationship is growing. I want to serve in the highest way possible in whatever way I can. That's part of why I do the podcasts and the YouTube channel. Like, I feel very uncomfortable doing those things because I'm an introvert, but I feel like it's my responsibility and because I have found a path for me and I have a way to help support people in that journey for them as well. I feel like I want to spend the rest of my life just figuring out a way to reach more people and serve as many people as I can. And that's one of the greatest gifts too. There's nothing like watching a person go through a transformation from not having hope and losing faith in themselves and not having confidence to watching them witnessing their transformation. That is something that I have so much passion for. I would love to go back to Ethiopia with my daughter. I haven't been there since we left in 1991, and I want her to see where we came from and like the land, her roots. And I would like to contribute to UNHCR, which is an organization that helps refugees. That was the organization that helped us while we were in a refugee camp. Oh my gosh, I have so many dreams. Like, I, yeah, most of it has to do, I feel like I have everything that I want, really, everything anybody could ever want. I have so much already. Like the just peace of mind and gratitude and everything I have. But on the outside, I guess most of it revolves around wanting to be of service in some way to make a difference, because I think um, that's the ultimate gift and desire that I have. If I can be, there's a George Bernard Shaw quote where he talks about he wants to be thoroughly used up when he dies. And so I want the same thing. I want to really use my life to serve others in every way possible. And I would say, most of my life up to now has been very challenging. And I am a very serious person. And so I would like to just have more fun. I would like to have a little bit more fun.
Oh, I want to ask about that. Where have you been able to be playful, silly, or even up to a bit of mischief?
I think the best times that I have when I feel like I'm having fun is when I'm talking to someone just one on one. I can just let myself be comfortable a little bit. And I have a very weird sense of humor. Like my partner always says that I make him laugh, and I'm just like, are you serious? What do you mean? And I I think the most fun I have is when I'm outside in nature, just going for a hike or a walk. I love watching funny things sometimes, like something that's going to make me laugh. But that is something I really have to continue to work on, is to just kind of be not having like a serious conversation, which I love conversations like the one that we're having. Um, and reading some book, or like I love reading, I love writing. So all the things that I do are mostly serious. And so I'm just like, as I get older, I just want to have a little bit more fun and be lighthearted about things. And I'm kind of working on that. Yeah.
Where do you think the that inner strength comes from to remain true to your innermost values, and to bring them as these edifying and sturdy structures in your life, so that there's alignment between what you value and how you live? I mean, you went in a career path and you left it in one capacity because it was so misaligned.
Yeah.
You found ways to overcome so much because you knew was that what you were experiencing, despite it being so typical, was not the right way. And then you built something for yourself that was so much more aligned.
Yeah. I think, one of the biggest examples for me was my mother. Even though, I have such a mixed feelings about my mom because she was my abuser, but she was also an incredibly resilient person. And she knew what she wanted from the time she was very little, that she wanted to get education. She knew that she wanted to take us out of the country. She back to school when she was 48 years old. I was going through my own um, education in university, and she was there. I was only fresh off of high school, and she was coming back to get a social work degree because she didn't have her credentials. And even though it was really tough growing up with her, she was also an incredible example of resiliency and strength. And she always told us we could do whatever we wanted. Like if I came home and I said, Mom, I want to be an astronaut, she would be like, okay, what do we need to do? Like she wouldn't question it. And so I had that example. And the same with my grandmother. Like my grandmother left my grandfather in for the last, she died when she was about 76. So she would have, that's not something that you do in that generation. You don't leave your marriage and your husband. And so I've had really good example in my life of what it means to be true to who you are and what you want. And so for me, at every stage, I was clear about what it is that I wanted. Um, and really that is maybe that one desire, consistent desire that I had, which is to feel better and to be who I am and follow my dreams and goals and my vision, the vision that I had for myself, for my life, and to trust that a way will be made for me to move in that direction. And I think that is something that all of us have. Maybe sometimes we're afraid to desire what we want, to want what we want, and to be who we are and go in that direction because we're afraid. I think that is something that all of us struggle with. But if you're willing to stand up for what it is that you want, then a path will be made. A path will be made for you. And I think one of the things Dr. Martin Luther King said was, you don't have to see the whole staircase. You just see the next step, the first step, and then the other one will be illuminated. And you can just go step by step from there. And I think that's what I've done in my life. And that's what my mom did in her own life, is we just took the next step that was logical, that was right, that felt like it was right. And I think our spirit, our soul, the core of who we are, knows what it is that we want. But our mind and our brain and our analytical mind doesn't know how that's going to happen. And the how is not our domain. That's not for us, our whoever, whatever the universal mind or higher mind, however you perceive this intelligence and force that is greater than us, knows the way. Our little mind does not know all the answers, and that's okay. That's not our job. So to me, that's a spiritual principle of trust in divine order. Like there's a lot of chaos in the world, but there's also order. That is the thing that grows the plants. That's the thing that grows our bodies, that breathes us. We don't have to think about breathing or beating our hearts. Like there is an intelligence that works in every one of our lives that guides us, that protects us, that guides us, and that leads us in a certain path. So I feel I have been able to trust in that more and more in my life, to a place where it has brought me here and now. And I am 100% sort of, I have that conviction now because I have seen it come through and helped me through so many challenges over the years, times where, I've had a few near-death experiences. There was one time that I did actually lose consciousness altogether. So I've had different experiences like that, and also near-death experience in a sense of really coming close to dying physically. And so I feel that, but even when I look at my life and how everything has turned out, I'm just like, I didn't plan this. Like I didn't orchestrate these things. I did my part, which is just put one foot in front of the other and keep going. But so much of it seems like there's a greater purpose. And I choose to believe that. I don't know that for 100% for sure, but I would rather believe that life is meaningful, that life is miraculous, and that life is a gift, and that none of it is an accident. I choose to believe that.
You mentioned your grandmother and your mother as well, and I was curious to learn a bit more about your upbringing. How did you relate to your grandmother when you were 14? 'Cause that's when she first became a mother.
My so my grandmother passed away when I was before I left Ethiopia, and I don't know if I had really she lived with us for a time, and I don't know if I had really appreciation for her until more recently, and when I learned more about her through my mom. But the reason why I always bring her up is because I realize what kind of life that she had that was so far removed from, my daughter was born in Canada, and I was born at home. I wasn't even born in a hospital. So, and then of course my grandmother didn't give birth. There was so many people in some of these countries where people die giving childbirth, something that is like we take for granted here because we have, hospitals and nurses and doctors around. So I just always think about that generation of people at different times and even different spaces in the world that we live in today that have drastically different lives. And so I always, and I bring her up to my daughter too. I said, listen, your great grandmother, this is who she was. And look at the blessings and gifts that we have today. So I find it fascinating to compare my daughter's life and the privileges that she has, mine coming to a new country, my mom, which had a really difficult life as well, and my grandmother, even worse, I would say. And so it's a way for me to ground myself in reality. Like, there are things that we experience just because we're born in a certain period of time or in a certain country. So I find that kind of fascinating in a way. But for me, it enriches your experience because even when you think about today, like this day will never come again. You will never experience this again. And so it's like, well, this is interesting. And you are born just at a particular time to a particular place and people. And so your experience is so unique. And and I guess, yeah, my grandmother, I always feel sad when I think about her because I know how hard her life was. And she didn't really have the privileges. Even, I love books, I love reading. I wish she knew how to read and write. Like, what a privilege that is for her to have been able to go into different worlds through education and to understand herself and to learn and to grow as a human being. And I feel like what we desire as human beings most is to unfold and to really be everything we're meant to be. And that process requires such a huge amount of education and awareness to truly unfold a person's soul and for them to blossom to who we're meant to be, the best version of ourselves. And nobody knows what that is, honestly, how far a person, like what they can become, what we can become. But I think one of the keys to be able to go through that process, you talk about self-awareness and creativity and spirituality. To experience all those things and to be connected to ourselves, we need education. We need somebody to help us, to mirror for us who we are, and to have conversations with us that are meaningful, to give us a space and to be curious about us and to learn and to grow and to have all those opportunities. And to me, being a Western person living as a woman in the Western country is one of the most incredibly privileged position because we can make choices. I can be a nurse. I can go to school and become a nurse, and I can work. I can start my own business and be an entrepreneur. There's no limit in who we can be and what we can do. Well, my grandmother didn't have that. She was a housewife. She cooked, didn't have electricity, didn't know how to read or write. So, like, what was her life like? And I think there's a sadness and a grief that comes with that. And also sadness and a grief that comes with knowing that there are lots of little girls and women in the world, or boys and men too, that don't have these opportunities to unfold their and become who they're meant to be. And so, yeah, I always keep her in my mind.
What do you remember about living through a civil war?
One of the first things I remember is just knowing that my mom was always worried that, so the regime that was there during that time was a communist regime. And they used to recruit kids to war. They would just come in and take your kid, like forcibly, even as young as 14, 13-year-olds. And so I remember my mom being worried that my older brother, before we left Ethiopia, he was only 14 at the time we left, but that were they going to recruit him or something was going to happen to her kids. I remember just hearing about war, and we used to have a little train station, train tracks in front of our house, and we would see the trains full of soldiers going back and forth, being taken to different spaces. And so I used to watch that, and then just hearing news on the radio and people talking about the war and what was going on. So there was just kind of that tension all the time. And then in 1991, when the first Gulf War was happening, so Ethiopia was ending one of that 20-year ongoing civil war because Eritreans wanted to separate. And so things came to a head, and Eritreans took over the country, and the president of the country, Mengistu, fled. And so there was all kinds of chaos. There was one day where there was a shell that landed behind our house, which left like a hole that was like a size of a car. And then there was a few nights where there was actual fight, and we could hear, like, we didn't sleep all night. It was um, um, just hearing gun and all kinds of just chaos. I remember one day being in school and having been told to go home, and there was like a lot of rushing parents coming to pick up their kids, and because the Eritreans were just entering into the city. And then a few days later, I remember driving down a street and seeing some dead bodies on the side of the road. There were some other things that we witnessed that were pretty bad. And then that was when the time that my mom decided that we were not going. We just took whatever we had on hand and just left.
You described yourself earlier as always being a deep thinker, and I'm wondering if that's a state that's a trait that you had back then. How did being a deep thinker affect you when in a war zone?
I I think, having a mind like that can be helpful to be analytical and think about things, but it can also be a two-edged sword in that I had a lot of anxiety, and I was worried about my mom. I was worried about safety. I heard stories of girls and women being raped by soldiers that were just passing through the town. And I just remember being afraid of like losing my mom, which, even though she was a different person, she was still important to me. And then there was a couple of nights when there was a real fight in the town, and we could hear guns being, um, bombs going and guns being fired and everything, that I thought, I think we're going to die. Like, I don't know what's going to happen. And just terrified. Um, and we had actually at one point an AK-47 in our house, and we had to, like, my mom had to learn how to use it just in case somebody came into our home. And my mom was always afraid that something was going to happen to us. So it was just bizarre. It was a very odd experience at that age to be thinking about those things. It makes me appreciate today just to be living in a free country where I don't have to worry about war, where there's police and order and like, so to me, those years when I was young, I couldn't make sense of it. It didn't make sense to me, but it was confusing and it was scary and I think that was what it was. And I don't understand war. Like I don't understand why people come to a place where it's okay to kill another person because they don't have the same religion, or they have some land that you want, or um, or they don't believe in the same political party or whatever it is. It's just like, it just blows my mind. I'm like, why do you want to do this to each other? Like, why do people want to do these things? Can we not just like figure out a way to have a conversation and get along and come to some sort of agreement? Why do we have to get to this place of having wars, especially in this day and age in 2024, when we have so many opportunities to get along and all of us are the same. We're not separate. We're not so dissimilar in many ways. Like, yes, we have our own unique individual experiences, but so many of the things that happen in parts of the world where people are having war, they're having war over ideology. They're having war over ethnicity and religion and all these things. And I'm just like, it doesn't, it never makes sense to me. It just blows my mind that how do you go from that place of, you know, how do you get to a place where it's okay to create that kind of chaos and violence and suffering for yourself and other people?
After you and your family saw the things you did, your mom decided to bring the family to a refugee camp in Kenya. Can you talk about that journey and living through it?
Yeah, I remember one of the things that we witnessed just before we left, there was mass graves being dug for bodies. And I don't know what that point was for my mom when she decided like this is it, but I think she knew along the way that she wanted a better life for us, but the opportunity just wasn't there. And I think this was just an alarm. And so we gathered. I remember we bused to the Kenyan border. It was days, and people thought, there was six of us. The oldest one was 14, the youngest one was 2. And my mom just picked up whatever little things that we have and we left. And busing was most of it. Parts of it was walking. It was a pretty scary journey in and of itself to get to Nairobi, which is the Kenyan capital city. And we ended up in a UNHCR office, which is United Nations Higher Commission for Refugees. And we basically said we don't have anywhere to go and we don't have anything. So there was at 35 kilometers outside of Kenya, and the camp is no longer there. But at the time when we were there, it was Thika camp, and we ended up um, basically being sent there. And I remember the first day we arrived, it was like miles and miles of tents. So there was people from Kenya is, I would say, one of the more stable countries in East Africa. So there were people from Ethiopia, Djibouti, and Sudan and Somalia, from all of the countries surrounding, like that, were refugees there. So we got there, and there were people who had been there for 10 years and haven't had. So the opportunity is the refugee camp, UN, they would try to resettle people in the Scandinavian countries, Australia, US, Canada. But that process is very lengthy, and there was too many refugees. Um, when we arrived, there was like 5 original buildings that were built off of brick, and then there was like a city of tents because there was more and more refugees arriving there. There was not a lot of food. My mom actually started making these baskets and selling them in Nairobi to buy bread and avocados and whatever else that we can find. And refugee camp was an interesting place. You know, we didn't know. My mom basically told us, like, we're going to Canada. And so that's what we believed, like this was happening. And we were just kids, and that was an interesting experience on its own. You know, the language was different and the culture was different, and we really didn't have a guarantee that we were going to be resettled. In fact, when we arrived, I think shortly after, there was people being uh, deported back to their home country, and so it was a pretty scary time there too. And we weren't going to school at the time, and food was
Deported from,
scarce.
sorry,
Hmm?
deported from Canada or deported from the refugee camp?
Deported from the refugee camp to your home country because they just don't have a place there. There's not enough space for people, and they don't have enough sponsors and people to resettle them to a new place. And so they're just like, well, okay, the war, some of those places, the wars were kind of settling down a bit. But most people didn't want to go back to their country. They wanted to go to a better place and move to a new country and have a better life. Even if the war hasn't stopped, I mean, there's been war in Ethiopia, even in the last few years, there's been some unrest. There's always some ongoing stuff happening there. And so it was a precarious journey there being a refugee. I remember one of the things I had to do, like I was the oldest girl in the family, so I had to always line up to get food. And there would be like a fight would break out usually. I was like small, I was like 10 years old, and we would have to line up for like hours sometimes. I think it was twice a day in the morning and then in the evening, and they would give us just very little, it wasn't a lot. And I remember just being afraid. I'm just like, okay, now somebody's going to get upset and want some more bread or whatever they were giving out, some soup, and a fight would break out. And then it would just be, and then I would sometimes have to come home with nothing. And that was one of the kind of humiliating things when I was a kid. But we were able to find sponsors to come to Canada. I would say in a relatively short time compared to many people, we were there for 2 years.
You mentioned that as the oldest girl in the family, was your job to collect the food.
Mhm.
What were the nature of the different roles, and what happened during the day in terms of the different responsibilities? You mentioned your mom went to Nairobi at times to sell the things that she. So yeah, I'm I'm trying to understand how the siblings took care of each other, especially when your mom was in Nairobi.
Yeah, so I find it interesting, like in a lot of our cultures in Ethiopia, women are expected to do the housework, like the cooking, cleaning, just sort of like there's some division of labor, some things that are considered like women's work and some things that are considered like men's work. And I know when I was growing up, the girls were always expected to do like the housework and or like finding food, like going and lining up for food when we were in refugee camp. That was something I did. Or, doing dishes, or like they almost consider it insulting if a guy goes into the kitchen and start doing, I know it's kind of, yeah. And I would say even going back as far as my grandmother, yeah, she was always the one who was doing housework. My mom, when we were growing up, hired some servants because it was cheap to find labor in Ethiopia. But I would say she would be the person who does most of the housework and the cleaning and cooking and all that stuff. So it was more that type of division of labor where the boys weren't really expected to do a whole lot per se. Um, and the girls were expected to do more. And so that's how it was structured, which is
And
not uncommon in many parts of the world today. Even in North America, they say women do a bulk of the housework and childcare and all that stuff. Even in our modern world where men are more involved and more doing those things.
what was the interaction between fellow children like in the camp? Were you, I'm trying to understand, trying to visualize where, were things set up by region, by country, where everything kind of mixed together, where you might have a neighbor who was from one country, another neighbor who's from another?
Yes. Yeah, it was all when we first arrived, we actually had a space in one of these brick houses, but we were told to share it with a woman with 6 kids from Uganda. It was a tiny little space, but everybody was kind of mixed in, and um, the kids, always didn't really know everything that was going on. So we just, kids played together. We picked up some of the language, Swahili, when we were in Kenya a little bit. It was funny. There was a church there in the camp. Somebody just like set up a little church, so people used to go there. But yeah, it's interesting how in those types of like times of hardship, people come together, and the religion and what country you're from or any of that kind of becomes a bit more unimportant because you're in this desperate situation where you have to live and survive and be together because there's no other option. So yeah, it was an interesting time in that way.
How did you maintain your familial and cultural traditions there? I mean, between birthdays, specific holidays, you're no longer in your land, and you're removed from the cycles that you are familiar with, where maybe your neighbors might be preparing for something because they're all part of the part of a similar culture. And here you are removed from land, and all the signs that are around you are no longer the ones that are indicative of, like, hey, we are in a semi-unified state.
Hmm.
Were you still observant of these traditions?
I would say, my mom was more observant of those things, and whereas I consider myself now, looking back, I have spent a majority of my life in Canada. I moved to Canada when I was in 1993. And so that was a long time ago. So I was able to more of adjust to this culture and consider myself more of a Canadian than anything else. But for the older generation, I think that was more important to them to observe whether it was the religion, which is an Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and the holidays and times of fasting and those types of things. I think people did the best that they could to honor those things, but when you're a little kid, you adapt pretty much to whatever is around you and what cultures that you find yourself in. I know that one of the things my mom used to do was make some Ethiopian food, even in camp, try to find different ways to people. It's incredible how people become so resourceful. And, we were eating Kenyan food as well, or whatever was given in the camp that was rationed out. And then we were also my mom selling the baskets and finding different types of other foods. And in Nairobi, I think there was a place where you can buy Ethiopian food. So she used to buy some of that. Yeah. It's funny because, all these little places, even like if you go to Toronto or some of the little towns, even that you think there wouldn't be ethnic food, you'll still find like, Chinese food or Indian food or stuff like that. So it's always fascinating how people always try to figure out a way to preserve their culture. And so those things weren't, I don't think, as important to kids, though, as it is for adults that are more entrenched in a culture and in a way of being and living. Whereas when you're a kid, you kind of adopt to whatever's around.
Do you recall any of your dreams between the time during the war and during the refugee camp?
You mean like things that I wanted in terms of dreams, like a vision of what I want?
The dreams you had at night.
Oh, dreams as in like actual dreams that you see at nighttime.
Let's do
Um,
both.
okay. I I don't remember like distinct dreams that I had when I was in refugee camp. That was such a long time ago. But I think when we were there, one of those like the actual like dreams that we wanted was just to go to Canada. That was the big thing that was occupying our minds all the time, was just being able to move into a new country and have this life. I remember just imagining what it would be like to live in a house and go to school and again, and what it would be like to be in Canada and to drive in a car or to have lots of food or clothes or whatever we needed. It was just thinking about what kind of lifestyle we would have. I have a hard time even sometimes remembering dreams that I have seen the night before. Like there are some dreams that are really distinct that I remember and I don't forget, but then way back then, I don't remember what I was dreaming about.
After you made it to Canada as a family, after emigrating,
Yeah,
what did it take to rebuild a bond with your mother?
that's an interesting question because I don't have a very good bond with my family. I felt like I there was nobody to attach to because we're all in the fight or flight mode most of our lives, especially in our childhood. And that is one area that is a bit painful for me because my mom was so had a really tough life and she was trying to provide for us, that our feelings and thoughts and how we were wasn't a consideration per se. It was more what she had to do to provide for us and to survive. And so when I left home when I was 16, I just felt like I had zero attachment to my family. I never felt, and everybody coped with it in their own way. And I don't necessarily, I feel ultimately what it means to be spiritually grown is to recognize your connection to everyone and everything. And I have been able to find my own. When I was going through university, I had some sessions in therapy, and my therapist said to me, go out and find your mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters. And what he meant, it was interesting because I thought, what do you mean? And he said, well, you're an adult now, like you are grown up. You can connect and disconnect with whoever you want, and you can choose who your family is. And that's what I've done since I was 16. I've gone out and found people who loved and accepted me for who I was. I didn't feel like, I struggled in my 20s because I wanted to have a connection with my family and especially with my mom, and for her to acknowledge what happened and what she did and how it impacted me. And she would never go there. And I realized after a time that we can't change people. Our families are who they are. And for me, I needed to break away and be my own person and find my own path. And at a certain point, I had my own daughter, and, that's my family. It's my partner, it's my daughter, and it's the clients that I serve. And I'm content with that. I don't feel that this is anything I have to force. And I love my family, and they're resilient people, and I love my mom. But I haven't been able to forge a connection with them that's authentic. And I didn't feel like I needed to force that connection. I'd rather I had to focus on the work of finding myself and connecting with myself and building healthy relationships with people that were accepting and loving towards me. But I think when you have a family go through experience like we did, it's amazing that we made it in one piece and that everybody is doing okay. And we're all, university educated, well-adjusted people for the most part. At the same time, you can't minimize the things that happen in families that can be incredibly challenging. And I know um, sometimes people feel, you still have to try to mend relationships and try to do the best you can to be connected to your family. And that, I don't necessarily believe that is possible in some situations. There are people find themselves in situations where they have a toxic dynamic and people are not willing to do the work that they need to heal or repair the relationship. In those situations, I think as adults, we're not like little children where we have no option and we're forced in that situation where you are within a family and you're dependent emotionally, physically, financially on that family and your survival depends on it. As an adult, we don't have that. We don't, most of the time. Yes, we're social creatures and we need connection, but we can also find connection in many different ways.
Did you have a period of a special kind of self-reflection when you were in your late 20s, when you reached the same age that your mother was when she lost your father, and you felt as if you lost her because of how much she changed?
Yeah, that didn't happen until the past few years. More recently, I think when I was in my late teens and early 20s, I was angry. I was incredibly furious because I felt that trauma that occurred when I was growing up had such a huge impact on my self-esteem, on how I viewed myself, how I interacted and how I showed up in the world, my ability to trust people. I think it had an impact on my education and how well I did in school. Like it impacted every single aspect of my life. That's the thing that happens when people go through verbal, physical abuse, sexual abuse. It changes the core of who you are. And so for a long time, I was furious. I was angry. I confronted my mom many times and my family. I distanced myself from them. And so I went through all that process. And then after I had my daughter, and I think after I went through that experience of, to some extent, feeling like I abandoned my daughter, and I realized that was when, and it doesn't make it right. So this is the thing I'm saying, that you can have compassion for yourself or compassion for people, but that doesn't, and I understand why my mom did what she did. And because of the situation and circumstance that she was, and losing my dad and all of it. But that still doesn't change the fact of how it affects the person. Just the same as what I went through, being on a cocktail of medication and being like a zombie and, not being there for my daughter, it still impacted her and it still impacts her. So it doesn't change the fact. But I had more understanding. But I also came to the conclusion of this place where a lot of people feel they are glued and connected with their blood-related family and bond for life. I don't feel that way. I think people can find meaning and purpose and connection and love in many different places and many different ways. And so to me, to try to force, I have had best friends who were like sisters to me. I've had older women that were kind of my mom's age, whether it was teachers or mentors or, nursing instructors or whatever the case may be, that were like a mother figure to me, men that were like a father figure to me. So to me, I found healing and solace in those connections. And I didn't want to force my relationships with my family where the bonds weren't forged. They just were not there during those years where I felt so alone and terrified and really terrorized to some extent by my own family, by my own mother. And so I have understanding and compassion, but I also have a boundary, which is um, that if you're not willing to at least acknowledge what has happened and be willing to work on yourself and to relate to me from that place, then I don't need you in my life. I don't want you in my life. And that's okay.
You mentioned that you've identified as being more Canadian now. You've been here a while, and that you've also been able to choose your own family and the people who are closest to you. I'm curious, in what ways have you embraced a continuity with your culture and heritage, and how have you found it stifling?
I would prefer to be neutral in some ways because I think when we overly identify with a culture or a religion or um, a certain identity, then it is actually a hindrance for us in many ways. Because at the end of the day, the reason we can always say that we're citizen of the world or citizen of just being human, the human species. There's value in culture for sure, whether that is the language. I still speak Amharic when times if I found someone who speaks the language, I can listen to them, I can hear them, and I can respond. But at the end of the day, I like to loosen the grip on those identities of I belong to a certain culture or I belong to a certain religion or this and that, because those identities are the ones that divide us a lot of the times. And so even though I say, I'm a Canadian, in the sense of that I have spent most of my time here, but the core of my identity, I would rather just identify as a human being. At the end of the day, we're all human beings and we're all spiritual beings and physical beings or emotional and mental beings that are traversing through this journey we call life. So I don't attach too much myself, whether to say, I'm Ethiopian or Canadian or I'm this culture or that one. I do try to take one of the things that I like about, let's say, Ethiopian culture are people are very friendly, they're hospitable. That's important. And the same with Canadian people, I would say. Being in Canada, Canadians are considered like peacemakers around the world, friendly people for the most part, easygoing. And so I try to take the best of both worlds and kind of, do the best I can in that way. But I wouldn't say I have a huge focus on continuing or kind of the culture per se or being attached to.
Do you remember that shift for yourself after moving as you were learning language, when you moved from thinking in your native language to thinking in English?
Yeah, I knew the alphabet when we first got here, but I had to learn a lot in those first few years. And I remember being given a tour of my junior high school with a guidance counselor, and she took me to the library. And that was the first time I was in a library, like full of books, because we had a couple of books when I was growing up, and one of them was the Bible, and another one was a book that I was told it was only for adults and I was not supposed to read it. And I read both of them.
What was
But
that book?
which one? The
What
other
was that?
book, the other book, it's I don't remember now the title. It's different and it was an Ethiopian book. And I think it was called something about like love until the grave or something like that. It was like a romantic kind of book, right? So I was just like, oh, well, there's no other books in the house, so I'm just going to read whatever was there. Um, but I remember thinking, oh my God, this is amazing. Like I'm and it was a little library, like it was a tiny little school library, but I was so pleased just being in that place. And the funny thing was I couldn't read the books because I didn't know the language. I would say most of my focus was in learning the language. So I remember reading the dictionary. I was that weird kid who was like words and trying to understand. And I used to watch Oprah as well. That was my favorite. Yeah. But I don't remember that like perfect transition. But at some point, I remember starting to keep a journal. I actually have journals from the time that we arrived here. And I read that now and I'm just like, oh, my English was so bad
Oh, and you were specifically writing in English.
in English. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
That's
I
interesting.
had some journals in my language as well, but I would say most of the journals are written in English. But the English, like I said, I read back now. I'm just like, ooh, I needed some to learn some grammar and yeah,
You mentioned that when you left home, your English as a second language teacher helped you a lot, and they
yeah,
saw things in you.
yeah,
And similarly, your partner also saw things in you that maybe you didn't see in yourself. I want to go more into that. I want to better understand what someone saw in you that you didn't see enough of or at all in yourself, and what they helped you see.
yeah. So my English as a second language teacher, her name was Shireen Daniels. She actually took me in. I had been started actually talking to her, and up until that point, I never really talked about what was going on at home with anybody. But she was coming to my school 2 or 3 times a week, and she was teaching me English, and so I felt comfortable and safe with her over time. And she was from South Africa, actually, and I told her what was going on at home, and she was the first person to say, "Yeah, no, this is not okay. Like, what is going on at home with physical abuse is not acceptable." And that was the first time anybody has said anything like that to me. And I realized, and I knew that was wrong just based on how it made me feel. And I remember when I first left, she didn't live too far from us. So I just went to her place. She took me in for 6 months. I lived with her. And she gave me that book, Ogmandino's book, The Greatest Miracle in the World. And I think that was the first time that I felt somebody really cared about me and listened to me and heard what I was going through and validated how I felt and protected me. And I would say she was the person who not only taught me English as a language, I always think of her as the person who taught me the language of love, what it means to love someone and to support them and to see them and to hear them. And, it was interesting. She had 4 kids at the time who were teenagers that were, and it was all boys. And they were, I think, ranged from a 9-year-old to like somebody in their early 20s. So, you can only imagine. It wasn't sort of like a perfect situation where I was coming into, as in, that was another thing that struck me when I look back now. I realize she was already had her hands full and she was still willing to support this, bewildered teenager who was coming from a situation that was not very good. And she was willing to extend herself in that way. So that was a pivotal kind of moment in my life where I felt like a stranger, somebody I didn't know, who took the time to get to know me and to make me feel like I was worth something, that I had something within me. And she was very gentle and just listened to everything. And she was there long after that, over the years, for many years, throughout my teenage years and early 20s. As I was coming up, she was a mother figure in my life. And then even after I had my daughter, she was sort of like a grandmother to my daughter. So that was such a beautiful and healing relationship for me. As far as my partner, well, we met about 9 years ago, and he is someone who just has this unconditional love and support and is incredibly kind. But he's also gone through his own challenges and his own sort of unique life path that and we come from such different worlds. Like, he grew up in Canada, like he was a hockey player. He played until university level, and he's from a tiny little town in Alberta. Like, so it's kind of funny how such a cultural difference in how we grew up and like how we came along. But he was also a very introspective person who values solitude and who loved learning. And his, you know, teacher was David Hawkins, who's a psychiatrist. That's the guy who wrote Power versus Force, a brilliant person. And so we're interested in both kind of similar things. But he always kind of looks back at me and my journey, and I've shared all of these things, I'm sharing with you. And he thought, that's incredible. Like, you could have been, based on everything that you went through, you could be so bitter and angry, but he's like, but you're still always have been a good person and try the best you can to use your experiences to help others. And so he admires that in me. And I feel like I was able to, I think the biggest thing with Ben is that I was able to be who I am, bring all parts of me and aspects of me, everything that happened, and still walk away with more. And I think that's one of the gifts, that when you do find someone that loves you for who you are, I always joke with him and I always say, I won the partner lottery. That's what I tell people when they ask about like about him. I'm just like, yeah, he's amazing. And the reason is because I feel like I can really be myself around him, and he still sees me for who I am and appreciates who I am. But he also challenges me in many ways, in terms of, I think when I have had that safety was when I was able to do a lot of the inner work and the work around trauma, because a romantic relationship, I would say, just similar to becoming a parent, is one of those areas that is like a huge arena for spiritual growth, because it forces you to look at yourself. It brings up all the feelings from your childhood, all the patterns that you've developed. And so it's been challenging, I think, partly because I have a hard time trusting in relationships. And so it was hard for me to go to that place to be really vulnerable and trust this person. But he was able to create that safety for me, that I would say I'm more blossoming into who I am today because of that relationship. And I've been in a few relationships before, and I'm grateful for each of them, just the same as, the other people that have come into my life, because I always tell people, every person that comes into your life has something to teach you, that you can learn from them and they can learn from you. You have lessons together, and a relationship that ends is not, one of my teachers, Robert Burney, says, a relationship that ends is not a punishment or failure, it's a lesson. And so I feel like now I am in this place where in the past I sometimes felt like I can't figure out romantic relationships. Like, if my life depended on it, like, I have no clue what the hell is going on. And I am at a place now where I feel like the more I'm able to be who I am and stand in my own power and do the inner work that I need to do, the more I'm able to feel more connected to my partner, to be able to give myself in that way. You know, some ancient cultures believe a romantic relationship or relationships in general can be a path to enlightenment, to a path to becoming more of who you are as a person. And so I feel really, truly blessed to have this connection. And I know many people long for that type of connection in their life. And I always tell people the path is you have to come to a place first where you can accept and love yourself. But also, I think having those types of connections allows you and mirrors to you your true self, those people who are really kind and loving and nurturing. When you have someone that could be in a form of a therapist or a best friend or a grandfather or an uncle or whoever it is, they're the real mirrors that can really show you who you are, even when you don't know who you are sometimes. So I I feel really grateful to have had so many experiences like that in my life. And I think that is part of what has helped me heal, a huge part of my healing. And, you know, my daughter was one, that relationship with her, and she had that unconditional love for me and support. And my romantic relationships were another area. My clients were another source of that reflection and love and support for me. So I feel really rich in those connections, you know?
On this path to enlightenment, to self-knowledge and stronger relationships with others, I'm curious, what questions do you hope this is like it's a pair of questions that feel like they fit together, and they're directed towards your curiosity. What questions do you hope to answer in your lifetime? And what questions do you hope to ask, but you haven't yet found the right circumstances or environment to ask them?
The biggest question in life is always, who am I? Who are we? Who am I? Who are you? Who are we? And what are we capable of being and becoming? That is fascinating to me. What can we create through our conversations, through our dialogue, through the things we do, exercising our potential, exercising our creativity? Who are we? And for me, I find that incredibly fascinating because there's always layers, different layers of getting to know someone or even ourselves. And when we can create that space for even a conversation like we did today, that is so powerful and beautiful for us to find out who we are. And then, you know, that's an ongoing kind of process of growth and learning and evolution. So that's fascinating to me. One of my favorite animals, for example, I read animal totems. So the indigenous cultures, they teach that each of the animals have something to teach us. So if you ever look up, you know, your favorite animal and you look up the totem, it just kind of shows you what it teaches you. And one of my favorite animal totems is snake. And the snake always ossifies its skin and then it sheds it. And so it's a symbol of endless growth. And so to me, that's how we are as human beings, and our soul unfolds in many different ways and on many different layers. So we really never know what we're capable of doing or becoming. So that's always a question to think about, and where we can go individually and collectively as human beings, and what we can do and what we can create. And we have only scratched the surface right now. We still have a long way to go in communication and our connection and what we create in our world. And how can I contribute to that? The questions that I would like to ask? Yeah, those are the questions I want to ask. Like, is this it? Like, why do we have the things in the state that it is today? And we've come a long way in many ways, with information and technology and everything that we have. But we still have things around the world and our experiences that people struggle with, that whether that is finding inner peace, finding connection. Many people report they're lonely. We have a fully blown mental health crisis in our world today. A lot of people are not experiencing the growth and evolution and the changes that they want in their lives. So why is that? And how come we have so much information but less common sense and less wisdom? And why is our spirituality cut off? Why aren't we having more meaningful conversations around spirituality or human evolution or our individual evolution? And I think that's part of what I really love about what you're doing, because you're creating this little sacred space and corner in your own, because of who you are. This conversation is possible because of that. And why don't people take time, take a step back and think about these things that are so meaningful and that are soothing to our soul, and our spirit? And so then we go from a more mindful place to creating our world, to creating and exercising our potential and who we want to be, and having that space of silence or solitude or introspection. I think that is my biggest question, is how can I share my experience and where I am right now of having so much spaciousness in my life and peace and contentment, and really cherishing each day and every moment, or even when the challenging moments come, and to have that perspective. I wish that for everyone. I want to give that to people where they can. I don't like seeing people suffer, even though I know sometimes suffering has a purpose, and um, people can grow from it and develop resiliency. But there's also so much needless suffering that happens in our world. I think there's suffering that's inherent in life, or that can be helpful in some ways to strengthen people. But there's also suffering that is absolutely needless that people go through. That's heartbreaking. I want people to thrive. I want people to move forward and create the life that they're excited to live, and to be who they are, to be comfortable in their own skin, and to be connected to the core of who they are and be themselves. That's what I would like to see.
In finding your health, you describe yourself as flourishing. You're able to read, write, and discover your creativity again. You mentioned starting the YouTube channel back in 2011, but that was on pause for a long time. You've been able to resume it more recently with a tremendous amount of output. Can you share about how you've communed with your inner need to create?
I believe that's a gift that we all have, is creativity. All of us. I think that's a deep core desire, just as much as we need air, just as much as we need water. As human beings, we want to create, whether that is creating a meal or creating a book or creating a healthy connection or a loving relationship or raising a child. Like, we are creative beings. Just, our mind is always working, our spirit, we have the ability to create, that we have curiosity. And so to me, I've always felt that it's sort of like a river that is always going, that's always there, a stream that always flows. And, kids nowadays go to school, and sometimes I feel like the school system takes the joy out of the learning and takes out the creativity, because they're kind of channeled in being a certain way. but kids learn, two complicated skills before they ever set to school, walking and talking. Nobody teaches them how to do that. They just pick it up because they're naturally curious. We're naturally curious beings. And so to me, personally, I look at creativity in the bigger sense of it is who we are as human beings. That is we find fulfillment in being able to do those things that bring joy to us. That is what it means to live and to be able to exercise your passion and your creativity in many different ways. So I look at everything, not just the work that I do, but even who I am being and the inner work that I'm doing is still work and creativity, or even having a meaningful conversation, you know? So yeah, I do feel some people say maybe they don't feel compelled to create things as much. They're not as driven, but I've always felt that I found meaning in work and in service and in creating things. So I have that kind of, I don't know if it's the same for everyone. I believe it is to some extent. It's just how much we exercise our potential. But yeah, I've always felt drawn to books, learning about people who are successful, who have, figured things out and like have found some peace of mind. Like, I used to like when I was in my teen years, I used to listen to like Jim Rohn and Les Brown and Tony Robbins and Byron Katie and Eckhart Tolle. And it's just like, I was always obsessed with trying to figure out like, what makes us tick? Like, who are we? Like, what's going on? I find that just fascinating. Like, being a human being is just this endless, there's so many things you can explore, and you can spend your entire life just exploring a tiny little corner about something, and you still wouldn't know everything, and the more you learn, the more you realize you really don't know anything, like nothing. And it's just like, maybe that's why the Buddhists say like you have so many lives, or the people who, not necessarily Buddhists, but there's many people who believe in reincarnation. I'm just like, that makes sense because one lifetime is really not enough. Like you need many more to explore or different aspects of being, what it means to live as a human being and experience all those different things.
It's hard to separate out creativity from some of its associations within mental disorders, that there's this seduction of hypomanic states, and we even romanticize them among creatives, the euphoric ups and the noxious downs. I'm curious, as you've come to experience a greater sense of health, how has your deeper self knowledge and your training helped you navigate these states?
I think, my definition of mental illness has shifted and changed over the years, or even what it means to have mental health. And I don't always necessarily look at everything in that lens of illness versus health. It's a spectrum. And as human beings, we experience varying degrees of like levels of consciousness. And there is a part of us that is a witness to all of it. Um, so, and some states, I feel like, for example, going through a hypomania, there is attraction to it. It is, you experience more creativity, you have self-confidence, you have like thoughts that are coming faster, and all of those things can be an interesting experience, but they're not sustainable. And so I find that, not to say that there's anything wrong with any state of consciousness, even psychosis, some cultures look at it differently. Even Carl Jung was thought about psychosis in a deeper way, in a more spiritual way. So I feel like we have to take a step back and look at the fact that human beings are able to experience many different things, many different states of consciousness, and some of them can be destructive. Even when you think about, emotions and fear and anger, where violence comes from, whether that's war or domestic violence or whatnot. So not to say there's anything wrong with any of our emotions or your emotions, not to say there's anything wrong with experiencing even deep depression. For some people, that's a call. Depression says that you need to rest or something needs to shift in your life. So I find that there is a way to make meaning and to understand ourselves and to look at it in a way that's going to be more empowering. And are there times when it's appropriate that, medication is used in those drastic states of consciousness where a person hasn't slept for 6 days and their brain is just about to snap? Yeah, I believe there's a place for that. I think psychiatric medication specifically can be helpful in short-term and acute crisis, but it's not black and white. It's not, there's complexity and nuances in how we view health, how we view mental health specifically, and how we view our experiences and our journey as we go through it. It's easy to want to say, this is illness, this is health, this is good, this is bad. That's the human mind. We want to put everything in a tiny little box, just nicely organized. And it's like, life is not like that. And mental health is not like that. Our experience of what it means to experience creativity and flourishing, those things are not, there's complexity. There's multiple factors that affect our health and our wellness. And so you have to be willing to look at all of them and to understand. And also, if you're looking at it from the lens of illness and dysfunction, then that's what you'll find. But what about looking at a person and their strengths and their resiliency and their wisdom and their resources and what they have learned from those experiences? And so I think one thing that I don't like about the medical or psychiatric system is this obsession with dysfunction and pathology, and sometimes to a place of labeling and diagnosing even normal human experiences to be illness. So to me, why do you want to rush to diagnose and to label and to medicate when you can take a little step back and see, is there a lesson even in this drastic state of consciousness, or can meaning come out of it, or can a person recover on their own given adequate time? And can we look at the situation from a higher perspective, not just physically and, your brain chemicals and neurotransmitters or whatnot, but why did they get to this state of consciousness? Like, what brought them to this place? Who are they? Like, where did they come from? What happened to them? What did they go through that impacted, the way they think and how they view the world and this state of being? Nobody comes out of, like, it doesn't come out of a vacuum. But in order to do that, in order to understand a human being, you have to actually take the time to listen and to ask questions and to be curious and to be empathic and understanding. Nobody has time to do that these days. You look at a doctor, they see, I don't know, 30, 40 people, 5 to 7 minutes on average. Like, you don't have time to really understand a person in that time. The same with psychiatrists. A psychiatrist will see you for an hour. After you waited for 6 months because they have a wait list, or a year, or whatever ridiculous time, they talk to you for 45 minutes and they give you a label and a prescription. That's just like, that doesn't make any sense to me. There's complexity in being human. in order to understand someone and to guide them through that healing process, it takes time and it takes patience and it takes the willingness to look at something from all different perspectives.
Based on where you are and who you are today, which of your younger selves are you most inclined to hug as a thank you for having lived through it all and giving you the assurance you need now?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I have a little picture that I keep in my house of like when I was 4. So there's that little 4-year-old brave little soul, that one, and I always think about my 16-year-old who is also pretty brave and strong. And I think about myself when I first had my daughter when I was 23. I think I would say those 3 kind of stages are the biggest ones, sort of like very distinct group of younger selves that were pivotal in where I am today. But I think that is the challenge for all of us, is to look back and to gather up all our inner children and those that brought us to this place where we are today, and to thank them and to give them a hug and to appreciate them, because and I wasn't always able to do that, but now that I'm older, and some days I feel ancient. Like I feel like I've lived 9 lives already.
Well, in having lived 9 lives, who are all the people you've yet to be?
Yeah, I think well, you know what? I think all of those lives are leading to living the one life that you're meant to live. So I think you will go through iterations and different layers and different aspects of yourself, but it's all that practice and that journey to be able to live the one life that you really were meant to live, to be who you are. I think that's the ultimate. It's not, I don't think I don't think of it in a way of like living more multiple lives as we go, although I think that happens too. I think that does happen. At least so far in my experience, there's been multiple lives. So I feel like, but I also feel like everything is sort of a preparation, that we go through a period of sort of what I call initiation, maybe under like, I don't want to put an age cap on it, but sometimes I feel it's like 40. And then you come out into a place where you can really live out who you are and be who you are. I think that's the ultimate gift and journey. But I'm sure there will be different iterations moving forward too.
You mentioned the tapestry before that's behind you
Yeah.
or to the side of you. What is the illustration on there?
So that tapestry was actually given to me by my mom, and it is the story of like Noah from the Bible. And I'm not necessarily a religious person or follow specific things, but I do have a connection to Christianity because that was the religion I was taught when I was growing up. And I love the teachings of Jesus Christ, which is, you know, he said all the laws hung in 2 things, which is love yourself and love your neighbor. So to me, it's just like that love and compassion is the ultimate teaching of Christianity. And there's wisdoms in every tradition, in Buddhism and Islam and in all of them. But that particular scene is from one of the chapters from Neville Goddard's teaching, where he teaches that we are powerful beings that have the ability to create our reality. And he interprets the flood and Noah and the rainbow and all of those, that picture around our ability to create and manifest our lives. So, which is a very different interpretation than the mainstream Christian teachings. That's what I love about that teaching, is he talks about the power of our imagination and our ability to create, that we are like the Noah in the ark. We get to decide what it is that we want to create, and we get to manifest the things that we want to manifest. And the bird, the little dove, is a symbol of hope. The rainbow is a symbol of hope. There's a lot of symbolic meaning in it, but the whole thing is around our ability to use our imagination to create the things that we want to create in our life.
You mentioned that when you had your daughter, you felt a sense of hope. Were there different names that you were exploring for her at the time to represent that?
Um, well, I had a couple of names that I loved from the Bible, and I had decided if it was a boy, it was going to be Michael, and then if it was a girl, it was going to be Rebecca. And so that's what ended up being.
What's something that you're surprised didn't come up in our conversation?
I feel like um, so many things came up that I guess one thing was that I thought we were going to talk more about the ketogenic diet for whatever reason, because there was that kind of connection between diet and mental health and creativity and all that stuff. But I also was not attached to what this was going to look like today. I wanted to show up. Like, I didn't really do a whole lot of preparation, because I thought whatever is going to come up will come up, and that will be the conversation, and hopefully it will be useful to people. But I wasn't necessarily attached to what it was going to look like. Um, and But I knew that, the topic we're discussing is around spirituality and creativity and self-awareness and healing. And so I feel pretty happy with how this conversation has gone, and I hope that it will be helpful to someone. Um, but yeah, I think that's it.
Was there something that you were hoping to share about your inner landscape that you didn't get a chance to?
I think I would say I have said pretty much, what I think and I believe, and it's so beautiful to have this space to be able to share things that are really innermost to me and vulnerable, some of them. Um, and I do share the things that I believe in that have helped me in my work every day. So I feel like no, this was a lovely space to just discuss these things in more depth and think about them as well, and be able to articulate them and in a way that hopefully makes sense to people. Um, but no, I feel pretty good in what I've shared, and um, yeah, I do.
One of the main areas of focus in the conversational portrait is about you becoming fully yourself over time, the continuous process. And so, in reflecting on this conversation, how do you feel about the person you're becoming?
I'm quite comfortable with who I am today and who I'm becoming, and I know that I am still becoming, and that is an endless process to learn and grow. I haven't always felt as good as I have and I am today, and there's still challenges in becoming and shifting into a different person that I feel I am called to be, and to be able to serve people in a higher capacity. And that can be challenging. But I like who I am. And that wasn't always the case. I like who I am today. I like who I am becoming, and I like what I'm doing with my life. It's meaningful, and I'm really grateful to be able to be in that space to say that. And you mentioned, the younger parts of myself. I look back now and I'm able to gather those aspects of myself and also provide that love and compassion. And so I feel like that's a good place to be. Doesn't mean that I don't have more work or that I could be better at being more compassionate towards myself, or work in situations where I still struggle sometimes with connections and trusting. So I don't think there's on this level a place where you say, I've arrived and all is well and everything is fine. I think you just get to a space where you're more trusting of yourself and trusting of life and trusting of people to some extent, and have a more fulfilling or satisfying journey. So I feel like I am in that space that I could look at my life with appreciation and gratitude, whether that's, my attention is in the past or the present or the future. And I feel like that's a good place to be.
We started off with learning about where you find your silence. Now I'd like to give you the silence to have and or to fill. So the space is now yours.
Well, I think this is a pretty good place to end our conversation. I don't think I have anything more to say, at least in this moment. I feel thoroughly satisfied and happy, um, and pleased with this conversation and this beautiful space that I have the opportunity to be a part of. And I really love what you're doing. I can't wait to see your launch and like to see the other interviews that you have with people, the other conversations. Yeah. And what sort of the ripple effects will be from all those meaningful conversations that you're taking the time to create and to give the space for people. So I love that. And thank you for what you do. I really appreciate you.
Thank you for joining for a conversational portrait. This really was a delight. Thank you for venturing into some really challenging stories.
Yeah, you're most welcome. I appreciate you. Yeah, yeah, that was hard in the beginning. I didn't realize that was going to come up. And that was a real conversation. But honestly, you know what? I'm fine with it. It's the truth and my journey and what I've gone through, and I try to do my best to keep a composure, but the truth is some things are painful in our lives and vulnerable, and I think crying is fine. I think tears are just pressurized pain and grief that's coming through. All right, that's cool. Yeah, I can't wait to see the other interviews that you've done and conversations. That's going to be so much fun. Yeah. How was it for you? How was this conversation for you?
I struggled so much with having to cut so many questions because you were giving such detailed answers with the ones that did come up.
Yeah.
and I wanted to ask more and more. So it was like, I can't impose on your afternoon and on your morning afternoon so much. Like I have to be respectful and cut, and I still want to know so much more.
How about
It
this? In 6 months, do another one.
round two. Yeah, there was just there was a lot I was very curious about, and it was important for me to understand, or at least I can't say understand. It was important for me to at least get a slight understanding of your experience in these very different lands. And the thing that I'm after is trying to understand how who you are is imbued in what you do. And in hearing this perspective from you on here's how you navigated this type of hardship and synthesized and integrated, really, that's the word, integrated the range of experiences. Um, now, now I understand the soft spoken strength you have, or understand at least a little bit more of it, and how you're able to carry yourself so in such a level-headed manner and with such deliberate and intentional insight. So that was it was a joy to be able to learn these things, to hear these stories about how you became you, how you're becoming you.
Thank you. Do you share much about your journey on this website or podcast or what you're going to be launching on? Because I'm curious to know as well what your journey was like.
I try not to, and not because I'm trying to keep it private, but in
Mm.
that the thing I value the most about a podcast host is one who stays, if they're interviewing someone, one who stays quiet. I didn't
Okay.
come to hear about the host. Unless I'm really interested in the host, I didn't come to hear about them. I came to hear about their guest.
Okay. Okay.
And, at some point, maybe it's important for me to be a guest on my own show, have someone else
Yeah.
be the host.
Yes, because you have, like, I am thinking to myself so far, like from the brief meetings that we've had, I'm like, who's Mick? Like, I want to know this person who's willing to ask these questions and venture into these conversations, deep conversations, and really important conversations. What shaped that person, and who is that person that is able to hold a container for people to have these types of conversations? It's just an idea, like, no pressure. But I am like, oh, who's this person? Yeah. Like in a really authentic, like curious way of like, this
Yeah.
is a beautiful soul. This is a beautiful person. Who are they? Yeah.
Here's the challenge,
Mm.
especially with something that's intentionally a long form podcast.
Yeah.
I don't, again, like I don't want to spend the time talking about myself to the person
Mm-hmm.
because I want to hear it from them. But I also realize that it's very lopsided. That I'm asking so much from the person that do they feel
Mm-hmm.
safe for me to not share more about them? Because typically in a dialogue, there's a much healthier balance than this very skewed portion. And I've thought about to what extent I think about our first call. It was a very
Mm-hmm.
different ratio of
Yeah.
discussion.
Yeah.
And I know that there are certain sides of me that are fundamentally not expressed in this call. But and that's why I keep coming back. But it's not about me. It's only about me in that what can I help elicit from someone
Yes.
that they want to convey. I'm not painting a self portrait on top of someone else.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think there's a space for it. It's just I think I have to find a way to convey those sides of myself in a way that feels non-egotistical, which is what I often am
Mm.
concerned with, where I'm sometimes irked by other media experiences.
Yeah. And there's value in it. And I think as time goes by, you'll figure out that ratio and comfort for you to kind of cherish the value that you have of people sharing their stories and you being the one who's holding space. And that feels amazing to have that with someone. Because then you can just focus on really going deep into your story. So I love both experiences I've had with you of the last time where you were a bit more open and sharing some things, and also this experience as well. I think maybe in a separate way, or like if you were invited to that podcast and you do an interview, please send me a link because I think when you have somebody who can do that in your life, and a lot of people don't have that, where they were really deeply listened to, or even have a conversation about a certain area or topic, such as self
Yeah.
awareness or creativity or spirituality, it's a gift. But in the back of your mind, always think, geez, that was an amazing experience. Like, who is this person? Who, like, what brings them to this place of being able to hold that space and be a container for people, and also to create those types of conversations? Because I can't have this conversation I had with you just with anyone else, right? It's because of who you are and who I am that this is we are able to create this unique experience.
Part of my goal with this is to find the people with whom I could find. So I need these types of conversations. This is the I tr- when I meet someone new, I'm curious about who they are. I want to ask them questions,
Yeah.
and when I find a wall or a temporary a temporary wall or a temporary bottom of the pool, I think I lament that because I wish that person had the opportunity to discover themselves more and to be able to share it. So I'm
Mm.
optimistic that they can.
Mm-hmm.
But this is the type of interaction that I think is fundamentally lacking, and I've
Yeah.
experienced that fundamental lack. So in part, this is my way of finding the others, where I know that I'll be around the people who can ask these types of questions, who also who want to share space like this,
Yeah.
and so that there is an opportunity to be asked. And when most of my meetings were skewed professional, I would often direct the conversation more towards them, and I found they the guest, or I mean, at that point not the guest, the fellow meeting participant enjoyed it a lot because they had a chance to explore themselves from that side. I felt like that feels like I was able to give them something. Like that feels great, and I was curious, so like I got that side met, that need met. And I guess what it's hard for me to admit is I don't think I have that need met of being seen as much,
Mm.
of being known in the way I'd like to be known. So
Oh, that is so powerful.
so part of it is like, well, I hope I can find the guests and I hope I can find the listener, so that there is I wonder what comes from that place.
Mm. I mean, it's a in a way, it's also a role modeling, and what you said was so beautiful. I want to find people that I can give this to in the way they want to be known and ask the questions to, and because that is really, I think that we crave, all of us crave that connection and the willingness for someone to be curious about our experience and our world. Like, I think there's such a loneliness around because we don't have those experiences with people, even the people that are closest to us. And I think that was something that I found also beautiful in my work, is that I could create that space for people as well and listen and sometimes share. And that ratio you're talking about in nursing school, in a professional world, you're taught not to disclose anything about yourself. Like, it is such a one-sided relationship.
Yeah.
But what you're talking about is in and of itself is so valuable for people, even the role modeling of what it means to provide and give that to a person. And I think all of us want that as well, for someone to listen to us and see us and have a conversation with us in that way.
I might need to tweak up the format because this is sounding oh so delightful.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, like I love what you're doing. It's it's such an important thing that I think people are craving right now and always do anyways. And what is the gift ultimately that we give to each other as human beings? It is to be heard and seen and loved. And that is what that is. That is the model of what it means to truly love someone, is you give them time. Time is the most valuable that resource that we have, but also to be curious about their world, because all of us have that subjective experience of what it means to be human. And to someone to take the time to get to know us, to say, like, what was it like for you to go through
Yeah.
this, and this? That is such, and I love the language that you used to present that.
I think one of the best compliments I can give someone that I hope to give to more people is, I mean, in my being super curious in general, when someone
Mm,
makes it easy to be curious about them and rewarding to do so. Oh, that's the connection.
mm,
And you have facilitated just that.
mm. Yeah. Um, I think that's a challenge for all of us, is to be willing to be open and to really just share from like the depth of your heart. I think every human being has a fascinating story and experience. I think all of us have. And if we're willing to take the time to actually be authentic and share without fear, then I think everybody's life is really interesting. Who they are, where they've been, what experiences that they've had. Um, and to I always have what really bothers me, you talk about, like, something that touches my OCD is just superficial conversations, like about the weather or some like reality show or something like that. I'm just like, can we talk about something that has like,
Yeah.
you know, substance? Like, I think there's a place to be lighthearted and whatnot, but I do crave that as well, like that deeper reflection on our experiences and our life, and or spirituality or creativity or whatever the topic may be, but just a deeper conversation, a deeper knowing or wanting to know or to be known. Yeah. Well, if you have anything like where you talk about yourself, where there's information about you, let me know. But I mean, so far what I've known is great and I love it. I love what I have learned about you and the conversations that we've had. But if you ever do a podcast interview or you write a book or about your life, let me know. And hopefully we keep in touch too,
Oh,
because
I
I want to see how everything goes.
unequivocally yes to keeping in touch.
Okay. Okay. Good.
Sarah, thank you again for taking the time. I hope you have a spectacular Sunday.
All right.
And
Yeah, I'm gonna go
um,
for a walk. It's so beautiful outside right now. So,
yeah,
and just kind of reflect, maybe just have some silence time.
yeah,
Hope
awesome.
you have a great afternoon too.
You too. Take care.
Yeah.